Why we think as we do. 20 philosophers that have shaped our minds. First, Niccolò Machiavelli, 1469 to 1527. Niccolò Machiavelli stands as one of the first pivotal figures in the transition from medieval political thought to modern political philosophy. Born in Florence, Italy in 1469, Machiavelli lived during a period of intense political upheaval marked by the shifting powers of city-states, the influence of the Medici family, and the continual threat of external forces from France, Spain, and the Papal States. As a diplomat, government official, and later a writer, Machiavelli's direct involvement in Florentine politics afforded him an uncommonly practical perspective on power and governance. In his early career, Machiavelli served as a secretary and diplomat for the Republic of Florence. When the Medici family returned to power in 1512, Machiavelli was dismissed from his position, briefly imprisoned on charges of conspiracy, and later sent into exile. Isolated from political life, he turned to writing, producing some of the most influential works on power and statecraft in the Western canon. The most iconic of these is The Prince, 1532, though it was circulated in manuscript form prior to its official publication. A brief biography. Machiavelli's biography is deeply entangled with the fortunes of Florence. He was educated with a focus on classical Roman and Greek texts, which influenced his later emphasis on history and the cyclical nature of political fortune. As a Florentine diplomat, he visited major courts throughout Italy and Europe, meeting figures such as Cesare Borgia, whose ruthless political maneuvers heavily influenced Machiavelli's political thinking. After being removed from office by the Medici regime, Machiavelli's enforced isolation at his small farm near San Casciano led him to reflect on the deeper nature of political power. He penned letters lamenting his loss of civic involvement, but also revealing his delight in studying the ancients by night. These nocturnal studies formed the intellectual bedrock for his treatises. Following the publication of The Prince, dedicated ironically to Lorenzo de' Medici, Machiavelli vainly hoped to win favor once again in political circles. Though he never permanently regained a high political position, his writings would echo through the centuries. Machiavelli's philosophical contributions. Politics as an empirical science. One of Machiavelli's enduring contributions to philosophy is his insistence on observing politics as it is, not as it ought to be. He eschewed the moral idealism of many medieval thinkers, preferring pragmatic, real-world examples. This emphasis on empirical observation paved the way for later political scientists and philosophers to systematically study governance without relying solely on moral or theological frameworks. In The Prince, Machiavelli famously advises rulers to ground their decisions in practical considerations of power and stability. It is far safer to be feared than loved if you cannot be both. This line marks a sharp break from earlier ethical treatises that placed a premium on the ruler's virtue. Machiavelli suggests that a prince may sometimes need to engage in morally questionable actions for the greater goal of maintaining the state, the question of virtue. Central to Machiavelli's vocabulary is the concept of virtue. While often translated as virtue, it differs significantly from the Christian moral sense. Machiavelli's virtue refers to the capacity of a leader to shape fortuna, through decisiveness, strategy, and force of will. Fortuna is the unpredictable element of life, chance, luck, or fate that can undo even the strongest leader. Machiavelli admires those who can bend these circumstances to their advantage, recognizing that politics involves not only skill but also timing and opportunism. Republican ideals. Although The Prince is the best-known Machiavellian text, his Discourses on Livy reveals a different angle, Machiavelli's admiration for republican governance. Here, he praises citizen participation, checks on power, and the role of conflict in a thriving republic. He argues that tensions among citizens and institutions can actually strengthen the body politic by providing outlets for competing interests. This line of thought resonates with modern ideas of pluralism and constitutional checks and balances. When there is great equality and likeness of fortune, men live in the same manner. He believed that conflicts, when properly channeled, protect liberty by preventing any single power from dominating. Rethinking morality and politics. The core of Machiavelli's philosophy lies in disentangling morality from politics, at least to a significant degree. Traditional political thought influenced by Christian theology often positioned rulers as moral exemplars. Machiavelli disrupts this by suggesting that the ruler's primary duty is the survival and strength of the state, not moral perfection. In The Prince, he writes, "A ruler who wishes to maintain his power must be prepared to act immorally when this becomes necessary." This statement has led some to label Machiavelli as cynical or even immoral. However, others argue that he was merely describing political reality without sugarcoating it. By focusing on practical governance and strategy, Machiavelli effectively laid the foundations for modern political realism, influencing theorists such as Thomas Hobbes, Carl Schmitt, and Hans Morgenthau. Enduring influence. Machiavelli's reputation has endured 5 centuries, with the adjective Machiavellian now used to describe cunning, scheming behavior. Yet this label sometimes obscures the complexity of his thought. He was not exclusively advocating cruelty or deception, but rather recognizing that a ruler needs flexibility to respond to varying political contexts. His acute understanding of power dynamics, human nature, and historical precedent resonates with readers as much today as in his own era. Controversies and reinterpretations. Since Machiavelli's time, countless scholars have debated whether he was a political realist, a disillusioned patriot, or a principled pragmatist forced into exile. Some critics see in him a champion of authoritarian manipulation. Others see a democrat who merely recognized that civic virtues alone do not suffice in times of crisis. He often juxtaposes stable governance with moral compromise, acknowledging that an overemphasis on idealism can lead to political ruin. Moreover, Machiavelli's discussion of fear versus love remains a focal point in ethical and political debates. He grants that being loved is ideal for a ruler, but, if a leader must choose, fear is more reliable because people are fickle. Nevertheless, Machiavelli also warns against taking fear too far. Excessive cruelty or harshness can spark rebellion. His advice is careful and measured, urging the prince to calibrate actions to the political moment. Legacy in modern thought. Machiavelli's sharp break from the traditions of medieval political philosophy has positioned him as the father of modern political science. By examining historical successes and failures, he championed a comparative and empirical approach that continues in contemporary political analysis. His work prefigures the later social contract theorists and realists who grapple with the tension between power and morality. In sum, Niccolò Machiavelli introduced a new way of looking at politics, one that remains compelling precisely because it delves into the uncomfortable realities of power. While his straightforward style and apparent indifference to conventional morality cause scandal, his emphasis on historical precedent, critical inquiry, and pragmatic policy shaped the emergence of modern political thought. Even today, phrases like, "the ends justify the means," though he never used these exact words, echo Machiavelli's core insight into the deep, often troubling complexities of leadership. 2nd Francis Bacon, 1561 to 1626. Francis Bacon, born in London in 1561, is widely celebrated as a pioneering figure in the scientific revolution and the development of empiricism. A philosopher, statesman, essayist, and jurist, Bacon's quest to reform knowledge was driven by a dissatisfaction with the Aristotelian scholasticism that dominated universities at the time. He envisioned a new method of inquiry, one based on observation, systematic experimentation, and the careful accumulation of data. A brief biography. Bacon's early life was shaped by his familial ties to the English court. His father, Sir Nicholas Bacon, served as Lord Keeper of the Great Seal, and his mother was a learned Calvinist who exposed him to rigorous classical and theological study. By age 12, Bacon was already attending Trinity College, Cambridge, where he found the scholastic curriculum frustrating and antiquated. He left Cambridge with an ambition to challenge the intellectual status quo. Entering legal training at Gray's Inn, Bacon also served as a Member of Parliament beginning in 1581. He rose to prominent positions under Queen Elizabeth I and later King James I, becoming Attorney General and eventually Lord Chancellor. Yet his political career was marred by allegations of corruption, leading to his downfall in 1621. He then retired from public life and devoted himself to scientific and philosophical pursuits until his death in 1626. Bacon's philosophical contributions. The Great Instauration. Bacon's ambitious project to overhaul the entire system of knowledge culminates in his plan for what he called the Great Instauration, a complete renewal of the sciences. This project was outlined in works such as The Advancement of Learning, 1605, and Novum Organum, 1620. In The Advancement of Learning, Bacon criticizes the static and narrowly textual methods of the medieval scholastics, asserting that true knowledge must begin with careful study of nature. Knowledge and human power are synonymous, since the ignorance of the cause frustrates the effect. Here, Bacon identifies the empowerment that results from understanding natural laws, a theme that would become central to the scientific revolution. He believed that gaining command over nature would require direct engagement with empirical evidence rather than reliance on ancient authorities. The Four Idols. In Novum Organum, Bacon introduces the concept of the four idols of the mind, which are systematic errors that mislead human understanding. Idols of the tribe. These arise from human nature itself, our tendency to perceive patterns, impose order, or be swayed by emotion. Idols of the cave. The individual prejudices shaped by personal upbringing, habits, and experiences. Idols of the marketplace. The distortions arising from language and communication, where words can confuse or misrepresent reality. Idols of the theatre. The dogmas and entrenched philosophies that dominate intellectual life, such as unquestioned adherence to Aristotle or other authorities. By identifying these cognitive biases, Bacon urged scholars to practice a disciplined skepticism, clearing the mind of illusions so that they might observe nature accurately. Inductive reasoning. Bacon championed inductive reasoning as opposed to the deductive methods inherited from Aristotle's logic. Instead of beginning with axiomatic principles, Bacon proposed starting from particular observations and gradually building up to general laws. This emphasis on induction would later influence figures like John Locke, David Hume, and John Stuart Mill, laying foundations for modern scientific method. If a man will begin with certainties, he shall end in doubts. But if he will be content to begin with doubts, he shall end in certainties. This quote underscores the iterative and exploratory process Bacon advocated, where hypotheses are tested against empirical data, refined, and retested. He believed that by slowly collecting natural histories in myriad fields, from botany to astronomy, scholars could establish a new, more reliable body of knowledge. Nature as conquerable. Where previous thinkers often viewed nature as something to be contemplated or interpreted in light of divine order, Bacon offered a vision of nature as malleable, an entity that could be harnessed through science. His belief that knowledge is power underscores the interplay between discovery and technology. He foresaw how systematic investigation could lead to mechanical arts that transform society. At times, Bacon's language about dominion over nature has been interpreted as laying the groundwork for exploitative attitudes toward the environment. Yet in his own time, the emphasis was on liberating knowledge from stale scholastic disputes so that it could produce tangible benefits for humanity. Wider influence. The spirit of the Baconian method can be seen in the Royal Society, founded in 1660, which championed empirical investigations. His call for collaboration and the pooling of knowledge prefigures modern scientific communities. Though later science would refine and complicate Bacon's inductive frameworks, the fundamental shift from textual authority to observation and experiment remains a cornerstone of scientific practice. Political and ethical context. Bacon wrote extensively not only on science, but also on moral and political philosophy. In his famous essays, he dispensed worldly wisdom on topics such as ambition, love, friendship, and empire. While these essays lack the systematic approach of his scientific treatises, they showcase his keen psychological insight. His essay, Of Studies, reflects on the value of reading and learning. Studies serve for delight, for ornament, and for ability. Their chief use for delight is in privateness and retiring, for ornament is in discourse, and for ability is in the judgment and disposition of business. Though Bacon's political career ended in disgrace, it informs his pragmatic outlook. His moral philosophy recognizes human fallibility and the corrupting potentials of power. By turning to systematic experimentation and rational inquiry, Bacon hoped to elevate society beyond the petty intrigues he witnessed at court. Enduring legacy. Francis Bacon remains a pivotal figure in the history of philosophy because of his foundational role in championing the empirical method. His critique of intellectual complacency catalyzed a move away from unquestioned respect for Aristotle and the scholastics toward the innovations of Galileo, Newton, and beyond. Despite the archaic trappings of his language and the limited scientific context of his era, Bacon's calls for observation, collaboration, and the careful removal of biases continue to resonate. In short, Bacon's philosophical contributions revolve around the empowerment of human reason through systematic engagement with the world, a concept that underpins the entirety of the modern scientific enterprise. By exposing the idols of the mind and prescribing a rigorous inductive methodology, he planted the seed of critical inquiry that would burgeon into the scientific revolution. Whether praised or critiqued, Bacon's insights into how we acquire and use knowledge remain central to the ongoing dialogue about the nature of science, the role of technology, and the ethical imperatives of discovery. Treasure René Descartes, 1596 till Sexton Femti. René Descartes is often hailed as the father of modern philosophy for his influential role in shifting philosophical inquiry away from medieval scholasticism and toward a new foundation built upon reason. Born in the Touraine region of France, Descartes was educated at the Jesuit College of La Flèche, where he received a thorough grounding in the classical curriculum. After a brief study of law, Descartes ventured into military service and extensive travel, seeking to expand his experience of the world. A brief biography. Descartes' life story is marked by his relentless search for certainty. While serving under various European armies, he claimed to have had a series of dreams or revelations in 1619 that convinced him to dedicate his life to the pursuit of truth through mathematical and philosophical inquiry. He eventually settled in the Dutch Republic, where intellectual freedom was comparatively greater. There he produced many of his significant works, including Discourse on the Method, 1637, Meditations on First Philosophy, 1641, and Principles of Philosophy, 1644. Due to political and religious controversies, particularly as his ideas about the nature of reality and the soul ran afoul of conservative theologians, Descartes moved around often. He died in Stockholm in 1650 while tutoring Queen Christina of Sweden, succumbing to pneumonia in the frigid Scandinavian winter. Descartes' philosophical contributions. Methodical doubt and cogito ergo sum. Descartes' most famous philosophical statement, cogito ergo sum, or I think therefore I am, is a cornerstone of modern epistemology. In his Meditations, Descartes systematically doubts all knowledge that can be called into question, the reliability of the senses, the existence of the external world, even mathematical truths, which he reasons could be illusions planted by a malicious demon. Stripping away every possible source of error, he arrives at one indubitable fact. The act of doubting itself proves the existence of a doubter. Thus, the thinking self becomes the foundational certainty upon which Descartes rebuilds his philosophical system. I have convinced myself that there is absolutely nothing in the world, no sky, no earth, no minds, no bodies. But I was persuaded that there was nothing at all in the world, from which it followed that I, who was conceiving this, was not nothing. From this insight, Descartes proceeds to argue for the existence of God as a non-deceptive being, who guarantees the truth of clear and distinct perceptions. The cogito thus anchors not only the self, but also a rational process leading to broader knowledge claims. Mind-body dualism. Descartes' dualism, the sharp distinction between mind, res cogitans, and body, res extensa, has deeply influenced Western thought. In the Cartesian view, the mind is a non-physical thinking substance whose essence is consciousness, while the body is an extended substance subject to mechanical laws. This dualism posed significant philosophical and scientific challenges, particularly regarding the interaction between the mental and physical realms. Descartes suggested that the pineal gland in the brain was the point of contact, though subsequent thinkers found this explanation unsatisfactory. Despite the criticisms, Cartesian dualism shaped discussions in philosophy of mind, psychology and neuroscience for centuries, prompting debates about how subjective experience relates to physical processes. Rationalism and the search for mathematical clarity. Descartes sought a methodology for philosophy modeled on the certainty of geometry. His 4 rules of method, introduced in the Discourse on the Method, call for 1. Accepting as true only what is indubitable, 2. Breaking down complex problems into simpler parts, 3. Proceeding from simple to complex, and 4. Reviewing thoroughly to ensure no detail is omitted. This structured approach reflects his mathematical training and his desire to place philosophical inquiry on the same rigorous footing as geometry. In mathematics, Descartes' invention of analytic geometry, fusing algebra with geometry through the coordinate plane, revolutionized the field. This interplay between abstract reasoning and concrete application exemplifies his broader philosophical approach. Rational intuition combined with systematic analysis. Mechanistic physics. Descartes contributed significantly to the rise of mechanistic explanations in science. He envisioned the physical universe as a vast machine, governed by the laws of motion. In Principles of Philosophy, he proposes that matter is essentially extension in space, and changes in motion follow strictly determined rules. While some of Descartes' specific scientific theories, such as his vortices theory of planetary motion, were later supplanted by Newtonian physics, his mechanistic worldview laid groundwork for the shift away from Aristotelian teleology toward modern physics. Challenges and controversies. Descartes' thought stirred controversy among theologians, scientists, and philosophers. The Catholic Church, wary of his assertions about human knowledge and the role of God, at times placed his works under suspicion. Meanwhile, fellow thinkers like Gassendi and Hobbes questioned his method and his dualistic metaphysics. Princess Elizabeth of Bohemia famously challenged Descartes to explain how an immaterial mind could interact with a material body, a question that continues to trouble dualist theories of mind. Another criticism targets Descartes' so-called Cartesian circle. To validate the reliability of clear and distinct perceptions, he invokes God's non-deceptive nature, yet his proof of God also relies on the assumption that clear and distinct perceptions are true. This circularity remains a point of debate and an example often cited in epistemological discussions. Influence on modern philosophy. Despite critiques, Descartes' influence on subsequent philosophy is vast. He inaugurated a period of intense inquiry into the nature of the subject, the certainty of knowledge, and the relationship between mind and world. His emphasis on doubt and critical thinking resonates through the works of rationalists such as Spinoza and Leibniz, and even his opponents, empiricists like Locke and Hume, were responding in part to the epistemological framework Descartes established. Descartes also shaped discussions of consciousness and selfhood that lead directly to modern philosophy of mind. Phrases like the ghost in the machine, coined by Gilbert Ryle much later, aim to refute or modify Cartesian dualism, yet they are testament to the staying power of Descartes' initial distinction, a legacy of foundational inquiry. Descartes' demand for an absolutely certain foundation for knowledge marks a paradigm shift away from reliance on tradition or authority. His methodical doubt and rationalist approach set the stage for Enlightenment confidence in reason's power to uncover truth. The lingering tension between the subjective realm of thoughts and the objective realm of extended matter has remained a central concern in Western philosophy. In personal terms, Descartes' life encapsulates the tension between seeking intellectual freedom, his choice to reside in the more tolerant Dutch Republic, and facing the constraints of religious and political authority. His final move to Sweden at the invitation of Queen Christina symbolizes both the high regard in which he was held as a teacher of wisdom and the precariousness of a thinker navigating a Europe still wrestling with religious schisms. Thus, René Descartes stands at the headwaters of modern philosophy, wielding a method that emphasizes clarity, reason, and the quest for certitude. The echoes of "I think, therefore I am" continue to reverberate, reminding us that self-consciousness is a profound and undeniable fact, and that from that single point of certainty, an entire edifice of knowledge can be painstakingly constructed or deconstructed according to the dictates of reason. 4. Thomas Hobbes, 1588 to 1679. Thomas Hobbes, an English philosopher born in 1588, is most renowned for his social contract theory and a starkly materialist view of human nature. Living through the turbulence of the English Civil War, 1642 to 1651, Hobbes became acutely aware of the destructive potential of political and social unrest. His best-known work, Leviathan, 1651, was composed in the shadow of this chaos and offers a radical defense of absolute sovereignty as a necessary remedy to humanity's inherent inclination toward conflict. A brief biography. Hobbes was educated at Oxford, where he studied classical literature. He served as a tutor and companion to various aristocratic families, including the Cavendish family. Through these positions, he gained access to circles of power and intellectual debate. During the 1630s, Hobbes travelled to France, encountering the scientific ideas of Descartes and Galileo. His experiences abroad, combined with the unfolding political crisis in England, shaped his conviction that a strong central authority was essential to prevent societal collapse. When civil war broke out between the royalists and parliamentarians, Hobbes initially sided with the king but fled to Paris for much of the conflict. There he completed Leviathan, which he dedicated to justifying a powerful, unified state. The work's publication was met with both acclaim and controversy, forcing Hobbes to navigate a precarious position upon his return to England after the war. Hobbes' philosophical contributions. Materialism and human nature. A defining trait of Hobbes's philosophy is his thoroughgoing materialism, the belief that only matter in motion is real. He rejects the notion of incorporeal substances, challenging the scholastic dualism still prevalent in his day. Consequently, Hobbes sees human beings as essentially physical entities driven by basic appetites and aversions. Drawing on a mechanistic worldview, Hobbes contends that all human actions can be traced to the pursuit of pleasure or the avoidance of pain. In Leviathan he writes, "For there is no such finis ultimus, utmost aim, nor summum bonum, greatest good. Felicity is a continual progress of the desire from one object to another." This ceaseless pursuit forms the basis of human motivation. Hobbes views humans as fundamentally equal in their capacity to harm each other, thus making life precarious in the absence of a stable political authority, the state of nature and the social contract. Central to Hobbes' political theory is the concept of the state of nature, an imaginary condition where individuals exist without a common power to keep them in awe. In such a condition, Hobbes famously asserts, life is solitary, poor, nasty, brutish, and short. Each person is driven by self-preservation and a fear of violent death, leading to a perpetual war of all against all. To escape this dire situation, individuals rationally agree to transfer some of their natural rights to a sovereign who wields absolute power to enforce peace. This agreement is the social contract. Hobbes stresses that once power is granted to the sovereign, be it a monarch or assembly, it must be absolute to effectively quell conflict. Rebellion or division in sovereignty reopens the door to the chaos of the state of nature. Leviathan and absolutism. Hobbes uses the biblical sea monster Leviathan as a metaphor for the state, conceived as a towering artificial person constructed from the multitude of individual wills. In his view, the sovereign acts as the unifying head, ensuring security and civil order. While this model endorses a robust authoritarian power, Hobbes argues that it is justified by the rational self-interest of individuals who value peace above all else. Covenants without the sword are but words, and of no strength to secure a man at all. This line highlights Hobbes's conviction that enforceable power is indispensable to uphold social contracts. Paradoxically, Hobbes's individualism and emphasis on consent help lay foundations for later liberal theories, even though his immediate conclusion is an absolute state. Religion and politics. Hobbes was no friend to the meddling of church authority in secular governance. In Leviathan, he devotes considerable space to theological issues, contending that religious interpretations must not undermine political stability. His stance on ecclesiastical matters triggered suspicions of atheism among contemporaries. Though he publicly denied atheism, his materialist view of reality and insistence on subordinating church to state put him at odds with many religious authorities. Critiques and receptions. Hobbes' bleak view of human nature and defense of absolute government alarmed many, including royalists who found his grounding of political authority in individual consent too revolutionary, and republicans who deemed his conclusion far too authoritarian. John Locke's more optimistic state of nature and limited government approach, developed later in the 17th century, can be read in part as a reaction to Hobbes's chilling depiction of anarchic conflict. Spinoza and Rousseau also engaged with Hobbes's ideas, either refining or rejecting his account of the social contract and sovereignty. Rousseau's famous exclamation that "man is born free, and everywhere he is in chains," directly opposes Hobbes's claim that humans naturally exist in a state of war. Yet it testifies to the influential template Hobbes set for analyzing human liberty, equality, and collective governance. Enduring influence. Despite the criticisms, Hobbes' articulation of the social contract is a landmark in political philosophy. His mechanistic explanation of politics grounded in rational self-interest served as an important precursor to Enlightenment thought. Modern political realism often traces its lineage back to Hobbes's unsentimental assessment of power and security. Contemporary debates about the balance between security and liberty echo Hobbes' warning that the absence of a strong enforcer invites chaos. In philosophy of law, Hobbes' ideas resonate in theories about the necessity of a monopolized legitimate violence, a concept later encapsulated by sociologist Max Weber. His discussions of fear and power remain germane in understanding authoritarian regimes. Furthermore, his materialism foreshadowed later naturalistic approaches in psychology and sociology, suggesting that social phenomena could be explained by basic human drives. Hobbes and the modern age. Though Hobbes wrote in a context of civil war, his insights remain strikingly relevant. In a world where states wield significant power to maintain internal stability and project force abroad, Hobbes' assumption that individuals cede rights for the sake of security still informs policy debates on surveillance, policing, and military interventions. Where do we draw the line between necessary authority and tyranny? Hobbes insists we accept nearly unlimited authority in exchange for peace, an idea perpetually contested. On a more philosophical level, Hobbes' articulation of the social contract as a rational agreement among individuals heralded a modern shift in the justification of political power. Power was no longer simply ordained by divine right or feudal tradition, but required a rational basis in individual consent. This is a crucial step toward liberal democratic thought, even as Hobbes's solution to the problem of order remains authoritarian by contemporary standards. In conclusion, Thomas Hobbes is a pivotal thinker in modern political philosophy, bridging Renaissance inquiries into human nature and Enlightenment pursuits of a scientific basis for governance. His unflinching depiction of the state of nature, his groundbreaking conception of the social contract, and his defense of a strong centralized authority reverberate through every subsequent debate on political legitimacy, individual rights, and the scope of state power. By insisting on material explanations and rational motivations, Hobbes laid out a template for understanding political societies as human-made constructs designed to manage inherent conflict, a premise that remains at the heart of modern political discourse. 5. John Locke, 1632 to 1704. John Locke, born in Somerset, England in 1632, played a pivotal role in shaping modern political theory, epistemology, and theories of personal identity. Often regarded as the father of classical liberalism, Locke championed the primacy of individual rights, governmental limits, and the use of reason and experience as the primary sources of knowledge. His major works, including An Essay Concerning Human Understanding, 1689, and two treatises of government, 1689, continue to influence debates on politics, education, and the nature of the mind. A brief biography. Locke was educated at Christ Church, Oxford, where he developed an early interest in medicine and experimental science. He became closely associated with notable scientists like Robert Boyle, reflecting Locke's commitment to empiricism. Through a network of aristocratic friends, Locke found himself deeply engaged in the politics of his day, particularly around issues of constitutional monarchy and religious toleration. His political views were shaped by the tumultuous events of the English Civil War and the Glorious Revolution, 1688, which saw the overthrow of King James II. Locke spent several years in exile in the Netherlands, where he refined many of his philosophical arguments. Upon returning to England after the Glorious Revolution, Locke published his key works. These texts profoundly influenced Enlightenment thinkers in Britain, America, and beyond, making Locke a foundational figure in the development of liberal democratic governance. Locke's philosophical contributions: Tabula rasa and empiricism. In an essay concerning human understanding, Locke argues that the mind at birth is a blank slate or tabula rasa. Rejecting innate ideas proposed by rationalists like Descartes, Locke claims that all knowledge derives from experience, either through sensation or reflection. He writes, "Let us suppose the mind to be, as we say, white paper void of all characters, without any ideas. How comes it to be furnished? To this I answer in one word: from experience." This groundbreaking stance set the stage for later empiricists like George Berkeley and David Hume, shaping the broader philosophical movement that emphasized observation, experimentation, and the limits of human understanding. Primary and secondary qualities. Locke introduced a key distinction between primary qualities, such as shape, motion, and number, and secondary qualities, such as color, taste, and sound. Primary qualities, he argued, exist objectively in objects and are measurable. Secondary qualities, by contrast, arise in the perceiver and are dependent on the interaction between the senses and the object. This framework challenged naive realism, paving the way for debates about perception, representation, and the mind's role in constructing reality. Political theory, natural rights, and social contract. Locke's two treatises of government lays out a social contract theory that starkly contrasts with Hobbes's more authoritarian model. According to Locke, individuals exist in a state of nature characterized by reason and moral equality. People have natural rights to life, liberty, and property that precede the formation of government. Unlike Hobbes's bleak view of perpetual war, Locke's state of nature is largely peaceful, but inconvenienced by the lack of a neutral authority to resolve disputes. The great and chief end of men uniting into commonwealths and putting themselves under government is the preservation of their property. In Locke's view, government derives its legitimacy from the consent of the governed, charged primarily with safeguarding the natural rights of its citizens. When a government fails to uphold these rights, becoming tyrannical, citizens not only have the right, but also the duty to revolt. This radical justification of resistance against oppressive authority significantly influenced the American and French revolutions. Theory of property. One of the hallmark features of Locke's political philosophy is his labor theory of property. He posits that individuals gain ownership of resources by mixing their labor with nature. If you cultivate a piece of land or harvest wild fruits, you extend your personal claim to that property. Locke's limitations on property acquisition, chiefly that one must leave enough and as good for others and not let goods spoil, point toward a moral economy. However, he acknowledges that the invention of money alters the dynamic by allowing accumulation beyond immediate needs. This theory has been both celebrated for linking property rights to individual effort and critiqued for rationalizing large-scale private ownership and potentially justifying colonial appropriation of land. Nonetheless, it remains a cornerstone in liberal political thought. Religious toleration. Locke was a staunch advocate for religious toleration, most famously articulated in his Letter Concerning Toleration. He argued that civil authorities should not enforce specific religious doctrines, as genuine faith cannot be compelled. By separating the roles of church and state, Locke anticipated key liberal principles such as the protection of religious minorities and the private nature of belief. However, Locke did not extend toleration to all groups equally. He explicitly excluded atheists and Catholics, fearing they could not uphold the social contract. Modern critics point out this inconsistency, yet Locke's overall argument for a broadening of toleration was revolutionary for his time and laid groundwork for modern secular democracies. Personal identity. Locke also made lasting contributions to the philosophy of mind, particularly regarding personal identity. In Book 2 of the essay, he develops a theory that personal identity is founded on consciousness rather than the substance of either body or soul. If you can remember an action or experience, you are the same person who performed that action. This memory-based criterion of personal identity shifted focus from metaphysical speculations about an immaterial soul to empirical considerations about consciousness and memory. Legacy and influence. Locke's imprint on modern political structures is profound. His articulation of natural rights and government by consent undergirds the Declaration of Independence in the United States and echoes through many constitutional democracies worldwide. The phrase life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness is a Lockean adaptation of his triad of life, liberty, and property. Figures like Thomas Jefferson and James Madison explicitly drew on Locke's writings to shape their visions of liberal governance. Beyond politics, Locke's empiricist approach influenced generations of philosophers and scientists, helping to cement the empirical method in Enlightenment thought. George Berkeley and David Hume took Locke's skepticism of innate ideas further, questioning the very existence of an external world or a stable self, revealing how Locke's philosophical stance could open the door to radical inquiry. Ongoing debates. Modern philosophers continue to debate the nuances of Locke's theories. For instance, critiques target Locke's notion that the Americas were effectively wastelands that settlers could justly claim, ignoring the property rights of indigenous peoples who managed the land differently. Others scrutinize the extent to which labor alone can confer robust property rights in contemporary economies dominated by financial and digital assets, rather than mere physical resources. Locke's concept of personal identity based on consciousness has also faced scrutiny from psychologists, neuroscientists, and philosophers who challenge the reliability of memory and the continuity of the self across time. Still, many see in Locke the beginnings of a pragmatic, human-centered approach to identity, morality, and governance. In summary, John Locke's legacy rests on his trailblazing efforts to root knowledge in experience rather than innate ideas, to anchor government in the consent of the governed, and to champion individual rights as fundamental to social order. His advocacy for religious tolerance and separation of church and state, combined with a systematic argument for personal freedom and private property, continues to define key elements of liberal democracy. Even as critiques refine and sometimes reject parts of his system, Locke's ideas remain a cornerstone in debates on the legitimate scope of government, the nature of rights, and the foundation of human understanding. 6. Baruch Spinoza, 1632–1677. Baruch Benedict Day. Spinoza was a Dutch philosopher of Sephardic Jewish descent whose radical views on God, nature, and freedom placed him among the most original thinkers of the 17th century. Born in Amsterdam in 1632, Spinoza's heritage afforded him an upbringing steeped in religious study. Yet his philosophical inquiries soon diverged sharply from orthodox teachings, leading to his excommunication from the Jewish community at the age of 23. He spent the rest of his life in relative isolation, supporting himself through lens grinding and dedicating his time to philosophical writing. A brief biography. Spinoza's early engagement with Cartesian ideas and the intellectual milieu of the Dutch Republic shaped his rationalist and critical approach. After his excommunication, he relocated to Rijnsburg and later The Hague, corresponding with other philosophers and scientists, including Henry Oldenburg, the first secretary of the Royal Society in London, and Gottfried Wilhelm Leibniz. Fearful of persecution, Spinoza published much of his work posthumously, including his magnum opus, The Ethics, 1677. He lived modestly, declining prestigious academic appointments, and died relatively young from a lung illness likely aggravated by fine glass dust from lens grinding. Spinoza's philosophical contributions. Substance monism and God or nature. Central to Spinoza's philosophy is the thesis that there is only one substance, which he identifies with both God and nature, Deus sive natura. Rejecting Cartesian dualism between mind and body, Spinoza argues in the Ethics that everything that exists is a mode of a single, infinite substance. This substance has infinite attributes, of which humans know only thought and extension. By God I understand a being absolutely infinite, that is, a substance consisting of infinite attributes, of which each one expresses eternal and infinite essence. This identification of God with nature is often interpreted as pantheism. Spinoza denies the notion of a personal providential God distinct from the world. Rather, God is the immanent cause of all things, not a transcendent creator. This radical move attracted both admiration and condemnation, as it upended traditional theological conceptions, determinism and freedom. Spinoza insists that everything in nature follows from the necessity of the divine substance. Thus, all events, including human actions, are determined. At the same time, Spinoza redefines freedom not as an ability to do otherwise, but as understanding necessity and aligning oneself with the rational order of nature. We are free when we recognize how our actions stem from the laws of nature and from our own essence as modes of God. This stance integrates determinism with a unique concept of autonomy through rational insight. In Book 1 of the Ethics, he asserts, "Things could not have been produced by God in any other way or in any other order than they have been produced." However, in Book 5, Spinoza speaks of the intellectual love of God, a state of enlightenment, wherein one comprehends the necessary chain of causation and thus achieves a form of blessedness or salvation. This nuanced view of freedom profoundly influenced later philosophers, including Goethe, Hegel, and Nietzsche. Mind-body parallelism. Spinoza's solution to the mind-body problem contrasts with Cartesian dualism. Since mind and body are attributes, thought and extension of the same substance, they do not causally interact but instead run in parallel. Every mode of extension corresponds to a mode of thought. This means mental and physical states are two aspects of one underlying reality. Spinoza's parallelism presages many contemporary non-reductive physicalist or dual-aspect theories in philosophy of mind, ethical insights, conatus, and the emotions. A core concept in Spinoza's ethics is conatus, the inherent drive of each being to persist in its own existence. Human desires and emotions reflect our conatus, directed either toward enhancing or diminishing our power to exist. Emotions are transitions in our power of acting, shaped by our perceptions. Spinoza's ethical aim is to cultivate active emotions, those guided by reason, over passive emotions, which arise from inadequate ideas. By virtue and power I mean the same thing, that is, virtue, insofar as it is related to man, is the very essence or nature of man, insofar as he has the power of bringing about certain things, which can be understood through the laws of his nature alone. Spinoza suggests that understanding our place in the universal order can lessen the tyranny of the passions and foster a rational, joyful acceptance of necessity. This approach to human flourishing places him at odds with ethical systems that rely on free will or divine command. Political philosophy. Although less famous than his metaphysics, Spinoza's political thought is also significant. In his theological political treatise, 1670, he defends freedom of thought and expression, arguing that the suppression of ideas leads to civil unrest and tyranny. Spinoza sees democracy as the most reasonable form of government, given that it aligns best with the rational interests of citizens. While he acknowledges the necessity of a social contract, he posits that individuals never fully cede their power to the state, implying that governments must continuously justify their legitimacy. His emphasis on religious toleration and intellectual liberty influenced liberal thought in the Dutch Republic and beyond. Reception and legacy. Spinoza's philosophy was considered scandalous by many contemporaries. He was dubbed an atheist in some circles. Yet a clandestine admiration for his rigor and boldness persisted among Enlightenment thinkers like Pierre Bayle and later Voltaire, albeit with reservations. Hegel famously described Spinoza's system as the starting point of modern philosophy, insisting that one must be a Spinozist before moving beyond. Romantic poets and philosophers in Germany were attracted to Spinoza's monistic vision, which offered a unity of mind and nature absent in Kant's critical philosophy. In the 19th and 20th centuries, thinkers like Nietzsche, Freud, Deleuze, and others revisited Spinoza's work, praising his quest for human freedom and self-understanding in a determined world. Nietzsche referred to Spinoza as a kindred spirit in the critique of free will and moral systems. Gilles Deleuze wrote extensively on Spinoza's concept of conatus and his ethics of joy, celebrating Spinoza as the prince of philosophers. Contemporary resonance. In modern debates, Spinoza's pantheism or substance monism resonates with environmental ethics and holistic science. while his refusal to equate freedom with indeterminacy speaks to ongoing discussions in the philosophy of mind and moral responsibility. His emphasis on understanding the causal order as a route to human flourishing prefigures aspects of cognitive therapy and scientific self-awareness. Indeed, Spinoza's lens-grinding trade stands metaphorically for his philosophical enterprise, a commitment to clarifying perception so that one might see reality more accurately. Current scholarship continues to unravel the subtleties of Spinoza's texts, exploring how his radical metaphysics can inform everything from neuroscience to political theory. The once heretical notion that nature itself is divine has found renewed interest in certain ecological and spiritual movements, while his robust intellectual defense of democracy and free inquiry feels particularly urgent in polarized political climates. In sum, Baruch Spinoza carved a unique path in 17th-century philosophy, weaving a grand metaphysical system that unites God and nature into one infinite substance, governed by necessity, yet accessible to human reason. His vision of freedom through understanding necessity, his parallel conception of mind and body, and his ethical goal of cultivating rational joy all stand as monumental contributions to the Western philosophical canon. Rejected by orthodox institutions in his own time, Spinoza today is hailed as a profound thinker who invites us to see ourselves as integral parts of a single, rational and divine cosmos. 7. Gottfried Wilhelm Leibniz, 1646 bis 1716. Gottfried Wilhelm Leibniz was a towering polymath of the late 17th and early 18th centuries. Born in Leipzig, Germany in 1646, Leibniz made groundbreaking contributions to mathematics, logic, metaphysics, theology, law, and diplomacy. Alongside Isaac Newton, he independently invented the calculus, and his philosophical system, which includes the concepts of monads and pre-established harmony, sought to reconcile science and faith in a grand metaphysical unity. A brief biography. Leibniz's early exposure to his father's extensive library sparked a lifelong passion for learning. By age 20, he had earned a doctorate in law from the University of Altdorf. He embarked on diplomatic and scholarly missions across Europe, meeting with leading intellectuals and statesmen. As a court advisor to the House of Brunswick, he spent much of his life in Hanover, though travels to Paris and London brought him into contact with the scientific and philosophical communities at the highest level. Leibniz corresponded with numerous contemporaries, including Spinoza, Malebranche, and Locke, engaging in rigorous debates. He was dedicated to creating an encyclopedic system of human knowledge, culminating in a plan for a universal language and a universal science. Despite his vast output, Leibniz often worked on several projects simultaneously, leaving many manuscripts unpublished at his death in 1716. Leibniz's philosophical contributions. Monads and metaphysics. At the heart of Leibniz's philosophy lies the concept of monads, simple, indivisible, and immaterial substances that make up the universe. Each monad is like a tiny mirror of the cosmos, possessing perceptions and appetitions unique to itself. They do not interact causally with one another. Instead, they unfold their states according to an internal principle. The monads have no windows by which anything could come in or go out. This poetic phrase underscores their complete independence from external causation. Yet how do these isolated substances maintain harmony with one another? Leibniz's answer: God pre-established a perfect coordination among them, ensuring that the perceptions of each monad align with the perceptions of others, thus creating a coherent reality. This pre-established harmony solution addresses the mind-body problem as well, reconciling mental and physical realms without direct causal interaction. The principle of sufficient reason. One of Leibniz's key logical principles is the principle of sufficient reason. Nothing occurs without a reason why it should be so rather than otherwise. For every truth or fact, there must be an explanation. This principle extends to God's creation of the best possible world, as Leibniz argues that God, being omniscient and benevolent, would choose the most harmonious and diverse arrangement of monads. Nothing takes place without sufficient reason, that is, nothing happens without it being possible for one who should know things enough to give a reason sufficient to determine why it is so and not otherwise. This approach deeply influenced the rationalist tradition, tying together metaphysics, theology, and ethics in a single philosophical system, the best of all possible worlds. Leibniz's famous claim that we inhabit the best of all possible worlds has often been misunderstood or caricatured, notably by Voltaire in his satirical novel Candide. Leibniz does not deny the existence of evil, but insists that any world that contains moral and natural evil must have some overriding good or necessity. God, in his infinite wisdom, calculates all possible configurations of the universe and actualizes the one that maximizes the balance of perfection, harmony, and moral goodness. Critics argue that the presence of immense suffering is incompatible with the notion of an all-powerful, benevolent God. Leibniz responds by invoking the complexities of free will and moral development, positing that certain evils might be necessary for greater goods. The debate on theodicy, God's justice in the face of evil, remains central to the study of Leibniz's work. Calculus and universal language. Beyond metaphysics, Leibniz's intellectual breadth extends to mathematics, where he developed differential and integral calculus independently of Isaac Newton. His elegant notation, especially the elongated S for integrals, became the standard in mathematics. Leibniz also dreamed of a characteristica universalis, a universal symbolic language that could represent complex ideas with logical precision. This ambition presaged modern logic and computer science, influencing figures such as George Boole and even Alan Turing. Critiques and dialogues. Leibniz engaged with major thinkers of his time, often critiquing their positions while synthesizing elements into his system. He criticized Descartes for failing to account for the full richness of substance, leading Leibniz to propose monads as a more nuanced alternative. He questioned Locke's empiricism, arguing that the mind contains innate dispositions or inclinations, famously summed up in his quip, "Nothing is in the intellect that was not first in the senses, except the intellect itself." He also met with Spinoza and studied his works, though Leibniz found Spinoza's monism dangerous and impious. In response, Leibniz insisted on maintaining the distinction between God and creation, even as he recognized the rational coherence in Spinoza's arguments. These dialogues illustrate Leibniz's style. Rather than offering pure refutations, he sought to refine and harmonize his interlocutor's insights. Legacy and influence. Leibniz's influence on subsequent philosophy is profound but often indirect, due to the scattered nature of his publications and the overshadowing presence of other rationalists like Descartes and Spinoza. When the bulk of his manuscripts was finally edited in the 19th and 20th centuries, scholars discovered the vastness of his unfinished projects. Kant, Hegel, and Schopenhauer all grappled with Leibnizian concepts, sometimes adopting and sometimes rejecting his claims. In the realm of logic and information science, Leibniz's vision of a logical calculus foreshadowed developments in symbolic logic. Bertrand Russell praised Leibniz's contributions, but also critiqued the tension between his logical rigor and theological commitments. Later, philosophers like Whitehead, Deleuze, and Rescher have drawn upon Leibniz's system to explore the ontology of possibility, the multiplicity of perspectives and process philosophy. Contemporary resonances. Modern interpretations of Leibniz continue to find new applications for his principles. His monadic pluralism resonates with quantum physics' discussion of discrete particles or fields, though direct analogies are speculative. The concept of pre-established harmony sometimes appears in discussions on non-locality or entanglement, albeit metaphorically. Leibniz's optimism about a rational, intelligible universe shaped the Enlightenment ethos. Although Candide's mockery of best possible world remains popular, some argue that Leibniz's approach fosters a constructive outlook, recognizing complexity and imperfection but aspiring to comprehend the reasons behind cosmic design. Philosophers, theologians, and mathematicians alike continue to debate whether Leibniz's bold metaphysical system can be updated for a post-Newtonian, post-Einsteinian world. In sum, Gottfried Wilhelm Leibniz exemplifies the breadth of 17th-century rationalism, aiming to unify science, mathematics, religion, and philosophy under a coherent framework. His monadology, principle of sufficient reason, and theodicy remain cornerstones in metaphysical discourse. As a universal thinker, he dreamed of bridging cultural, intellectual, and even theological divides, offering a systematic vision that sought harmony at every level. His legacy endures as a testament to human curiosity and the ambition to find reason, clarity, and order in a universe that still captivates us with its complexity and mystery. Osmi, George Berkeley, 1685, 1753. George Berkeley, an Irish philosopher and Anglican bishop, played a central role in the development of empiricism. Born in 1685 at Dysart Castle in County Kilkenny, Ireland, Berkeley became one of the most influential figures to challenge the materialist assumptions of his predecessors and contemporaries. Best known for his dictum, "To be is to be perceived," esse est percipi, Berkeley pushed empiricism to its radical conclusion that material substance does not exist independently of the mind. A brief biography. Berkeley studied at Trinity College, Dublin, where he later held a fellowship. His early works, such as an essay towards a new theory of vision, 1709, and a treatise concerning the principles of human knowledge, 1710, established his philosophical reputation. Motivated by missionary zeal, Berkeley traveled to the American colonies with plans to found a college in Bermuda, though he was ultimately unsuccessful. He served as Bishop of Cloyne in Ireland from 1734 until his retirement. Throughout his life, Berkeley remained deeply concerned with the moral and spiritual dimensions of human experience. His philosophical writings aimed not only to solve skeptical puzzles, but also to affirm the existence and providence of God as the ultimate cause and sustainer of reality. Berkeley's philosophical contributions. Immaterialism. Berkeley's most provocative thesis is immaterialism, the claim that physical objects exist only insofar as they are perceived by a mind. According to Berkeley, all we can know are the perceptions, or ideas, we experience. If material substance existed independently of the mind, we would have no way of confirming its existence, since we only ever encounter our own perceptions. All the choir of heaven and furniture of earth, in a word, all those bodies which compose the mighty frame of the world, have not any subsistence without a mind. This radical stance was Berkeley's response to Locke's distinction between primary and secondary qualities. Berkeley argued that both are equally mind-dependent. Extension, motion, and solidity are just as reliant on perception as color or taste. God as the eternal perceiver. If things only exist while perceived, then what happens to objects when no human mind perceives them? Berkeley's solution is that God, an infinite and all-encompassing spirit, perceives everything continuously. This divine perception upholds the consistency and persistence of the world. For Berkeley, immaterialism aligns with a religious worldview. The stability of reality testifies to God's omnipresence. We are inclined to think that the things we perceive are not out of the mind because they appear to us in a constant order, but this is sufficiently accounted for by the uniform working of a supreme spirit. Thus, Berkeley's immaterialism serves a dual purpose. It counters skeptical worries about the external world, for it never truly exists unperceived, and underscores a theistic conception of a reality sustained by God's ongoing perception. Critique of abstraction. Berkeley critiques the notion of abstract ideas as proposed by Locke. He denies that we can form an idea of something like triangle in general that is not any particular shape or size. Instead, every idea in the mind is a specific instance, say a scalene or an isosceles triangle. This critique extends to language, where Berkeley insists that words do not stand for abstract universals, but for particular ideas, though they can be used in a generalized way. Contributions to philosophy of perception. In his new theory of vision, Berkeley investigates how we perceive distance and size, arguing that our visual data is interpreted in conjunction with tactile experiences. This pioneering work in visual perception prefigured later studies in psychology. By focusing on the relational nature of sensory experience, Berkeley paved the way for an empirical account of how we construct a coherent world from disparate sensory inputs. Reception and criticisms. Berkeley's contemporaries found his immaterialism startling. Samuel Johnson reportedly attempted to refute Berkeley by kicking a large stone and exclaiming, "I refute it thus," implying that the stone's material reality was self-evident. David Hume, an admirer of Berkeley, pointed out that Berkeley's system, while logically consistent, does not ultimately quell skepticism. it merely shifts the puzzle to God's continuous perception. Others have criticized Berkeley's reliance on God's omnipresence as a philosophical deus ex machina. Furthermore, the distinction between ideas and the perceiving spirit raises questions about how finite minds relate to the infinite mind. Berkeley's refusal to acknowledge any unconscious support for material objects outside perception appears to some as an ad hoc theological assumption. Lasting influence. Despite the critiques, Berkeley remains a key figure in the history of empiricism. His emphasis on the mind dependence of sensory qualities resonates with various anti-realist and phenomenalist theories in philosophy. Phenomenology and some strains of idealism, especially those advanced by Immanuel Kant and later German thinkers, owe a conceptual debt to Berkeley's radical reimagining of the subject-object relationship. Berkeley's approach also anticipated certain lines of 20th century thought. The logical positivist's dismissal of metaphysical assertions and the emphasis on sense data have parallels with Berkeley's emphasis on immediate perception. Meanwhile, scientific inquiries into perception confirm that our knowledge of the external world is mediated by complex neural processes, hinting, though not conclusively, toward the mind-centric stance Berkeley championed: philosophical theology and morality. Beyond epistemology and metaphysics, Berkeley also wrote on morality and ethics, viewing them through a Christian framework. He saw human happiness as rooted in understanding our dependence on God. Social harmony in his mind relied on recognizing God's pervasive presence in our moral and physical realities. His later works, including Alciphron, 1732, engage in apologetics, defending Christianity against secular and deist critiques. Berkeley's legacy in Ireland and America. Berkeley's mission to the New World left a cultural mark, particularly in Rhode Island, where he resided for a time. Though his Bermuda College plan never materialized, he donated his library and estate to local institutions, contributing to American intellectual life. In Ireland, his tenure as Bishop of Cloyne connected him to broader Enlightenment debates on education and social reform. While not as widely read today as Locke or Hume, Berkeley's philosophical arguments remain a fascinating case study in the boundaries of empiricism. By eliminating a material substrate, Berkeley sharpened the question: what justifies our everyday belief in an external world? His solution, God's infinite perception, highlights the interplay between religious conviction and philosophical reasoning in the early modern period. In conclusion, George Berkeley stands as one of the most daring thinkers within the empiricist tradition. By pushing Locke's insights about perception to their logical extreme, he constructed an entire worldview in which the existence of matter independent of mind is denied. Though controversial, his system has challenged centuries of philosophers to re-examine assumptions about reality, perception, and the role of the divine. For Berkeley, the very act of perceiving is proof that we exist in a world thoroughly bound to the perceiver, a world that ultimately reveals the ceaseless activity of a benevolent God. 9. David Hume, 1711 to 1776. David Hume, born in Edinburgh, Scotland in 1711, is widely regarded as one of the greatest philosophers to write in the English language. A central figure in the empiricist tradition, Hume extended and radicalized Locke's and Berkeley's critiques of rationalist metaphysics, culminating in a profound skepticism about causation, the self, and religious belief. Beyond philosophy, Hume was an essayist, historian, and economist, whose clear prose and keen insights influenced the Enlightenment across Europe. A brief biography. Hume studied at the University of Edinburgh, leaving at around age 15 to pursue his own course of study in philosophy and literature. He spent a period in France where he composed his first major work, A Treatise of Human Nature, 1739–40. This work was initially met with indifference, prompting Hume to reshape his ideas into more accessible essays and philosophical inquiries, notably an inquiry concerning human understanding, 1748, and an inquiry concerning the principles of morals, 1751. Despite his brilliance, Hume struggled for academic appointment due to suspicions of atheism. He served in various diplomatic and clerical capacities and wrote a 6-volume history of England. In his later years, Hume's warmth and sociability made him friends among prominent intellectuals, including Adam Smith. He died in Edinburgh in 1776, confident in his philosophical views, yet aware of the controversy they engendered. Hume's philosophical contributions. Empiricism and impressions versus ideas. At the core of Hume's philosophy lies the assertion that all knowledge derives from experience. He distinguishes between impressions, vivid sensory experiences and emotions, and ideas, pale copies of impressions in thought. Hume systematically dismantles the notion of innate ideas, insisting instead that any concept not traceable to an impression is suspect or meaningless. Skepticism about causation. Perhaps Hume's most famous philosophical challenge is his analysis of causation. Observing that we never directly perceive a necessary connection between events, only a constant conjunction, Hume argues that our belief in causality arises from habit or custom rather than rational deduction. When we see that one event follows another repeatedly, we psychologically anticipate the same sequence in the future. But reason alone cannot justify that expectation. It merely captures a pattern we have become accustomed to. All events seem entirely loose and separate. One event follows another, but we never can observe any tie between them. They seem conjoined, but never connected. This insight undermines the certainty of scientific induction, posing a challenge that philosophers and scientists still grapple with. How to justify inductive reasoning about the future based on the past. The problem of induction. Closely tied to Hume's skepticism about causation is what came to be known as the problem of induction. We assume that the future will resemble the past, but this assumption cannot be proven by rational means without circularity. Philosophers from Karl Popper to Nelson Goodman have attempted to resolve or reframe Hume's challenge, but its basic enigma remains. Hume's analysis underscores the limits of empirical inquiry and the non-rational foundations of much human knowledge. Bundle theory of the self. Hume famously rejected the notion of a permanent unified self that exists beneath or beyond one's perceptions. Instead, he proposed that the self is merely a bundle or collection of different perceptions, in constant flux. When we look for the I, we only find particular impressions, sensations, emotions, memories, thoughts. There is no core essence that remains the same over time. This stance, called the bundle theory, foreshadows modern discussions in psychology and philosophy of mind regarding personal identity. Moral philosophy and sentiment. In an inquiry concerning the principles of morals, Hume posits that moral distinctions are founded on sentiment rather than reason. While reason can inform us of facts, it is our emotive responses, feelings of approval or disapproval, that lead us to label actions or character traits as virtuous or vicious. Hume's emphasis on sympathy as a basis for moral judgment laid the groundwork for later sentimentalist and utilitarian ethics. He famously stated that reason is and ought only to be the slave of the passions, underscoring that rational reflection alone cannot generate moral motivation. Religion and miracles. Hume was critical of organized religion and any attempt to prove God's existence through rational argument. In his essay Of Miracles, part of the inquiry concerning human understanding, he defines a miracle as a violation of the laws of nature, and contends that it is always more rational to assume error or deception than to believe that a miracle has occurred. This bold stance fueled accusations of atheism and irreverence, yet it also paved the way for a more skeptical and empirical approach to religious claims. Impact and influence. Hume's work had a profound effect on philosophers such as Immanuel Kant, who credited Hume with awakening him from his dogmatic slumber. Kant's critique of pure reason can be seen as an attempt to resolve the crisis Hume sparked regarding causality and the limits of empirical knowledge. On the other side, Hume's naturalistic explanations of human behavior and the mind influenced the Scottish Enlightenment and found echoes in the moral philosophy of Adam Smith. Positivists, pragmatists, and analytic philosophers have embraced Hume's emphasis on experience and clarity, even as they challenge or refine his skepticism. In the 20th century, logical positivists praised Hume's demand that meaningful statements be grounded in sensory experience, while contemporary cognitive science sometimes invokes Hume's views on habit formation to explain learning processes. Modern relevance. Hume's arguments about induction remain particularly resonant in scientific methodology. While scientists proceed with assumptions of causal order, Hume's skepticism reminds us that empirically grounded generalizations are contingent, always open to revision. His bundle theory of the self also resonates with modern neuroscience, which sees the sense of a unified self as a construct emerging from myriad neural processes. Debates in metaethics still reference Hume's is-ought distinction, wherein he notes a logical gap between descriptive statements, what is, and prescriptive statements, what ought to be. This principle has shaped discussions on moral realism and subjectivism, guiding philosophers to scrutinize how moral values can be derived, or not derived, from factual claims. Historical writing and essays. Outside pure philosophy, Hume's historical works were immensely popular in his lifetime. His History of England framed historical events with a philosophical eye, though some criticized him for perceived bias toward Tory perspectives. His essays covered a wide range of topics: politics, economics, aesthetics, offering a blend of wit and insight that made him a beloved figure in intellectual salons. In conclusion, David Hume is a towering figure whose brand of empiricism and skepticism has left an indelible mark on Western philosophy. By questioning the foundations of causation, induction, the self, and religious belief, Hume laid bare the fragility of our epistemological assumptions. His emphasis on sentiment in morality helped shift ethical discourse away from purely rational or theological frameworks. Though met with resistance and controversy in his own time, Hume's clear-sighted analysis has resonated through centuries, continually challenging philosophers and scientists to examine the underpinnings of knowledge, belief, and human nature itself. 10. Immanuel Kant, 19 lat 24 do 18 lat 904. Immanuel Kant, born in Königsberg, now Kaliningrad, Russia, in 1724, stands as a central figure in modern philosophy. In response to the empiricism of Locke and Hume and the rationalism of Descartes, Spinoza and Leibniz, Kant famously declared a Copernican revolution in philosophy, a radical shift in the way we conceive of knowledge, morality, and human autonomy. His critical philosophy, encapsulated in 3 monumental critiques, reshaped metaphysics, epistemology, ethics, and aesthetics. A brief biography. Kant spent almost his entire life in Königsberg, where he studied at the local university and later served as a professor. Initially interested in natural sciences, he produced works on astronomy and geography before turning to more systematic, philosophical investigations. The publication of Critique of Pure Reason, 1781, was a watershed moment, though its dense style led Kant to provide clarifying texts such as the Prolegomena to Any Future Metaphysics, 1783. He followed with Critique of Practical Reason, 1788, and Critique of the Power of Judgment, 1790, solidifying his status as a philosopher of comprehensive scope. Kant led a famously disciplined life, rarely leaving his hometown. His punctual daily walks became a local legend. Urban lore suggests that the citizens of Königsberg set their clocks by his routine. He died in 1804, having inspired generations of thinkers to grapple with his critical system and its implications. Kant's philosophical contributions. The Copernican revolution in epistemology. Prior to Kant, debate raged between rationalists who claimed knowledge arises from innate ideas and empiricists who located knowledge in sense experience. Kant argued that both traditions missed the key insight: the mind actively structures experience. In the same way, Copernicus changed our understanding of astronomy by placing the sun, not the earth, at the center. Kant revolutionized epistemology by positing that objects conform to our ways of knowing, rather than our knowledge conforming to objects. Thoughts without content are empty. Intuitions without concepts are blind. This pithy statement encapsulates Kant's view that both sensory intuition, the raw data of experience, and concepts of the understanding, categories such as causality, substance, and unity, are necessary for knowledge. We cannot know things in themselves, noumena, as they exist independently of our perception. We only know phenomena, things as they appear to us within the framework imposed by our mind. synthetic a priori judgments. Kant introduced the distinction between analytic and synthetic judgments, as well as a priori and a posteriori knowledge. He argued that certain judgments are synthetic a priori, meaning they are informative, not just tautological, yet known independently of experience. Mathematical truths and the fundamental principles of physics, for example, rely on innate structures of the mind, such as space and time, as forms of intuition and the categories of understanding. This daring claim solved the puzzle raised by Hume, who denied that we could rationally justify necessary truths about causation or mathematics from sense experience alone. Kant's theory posited that these truths come from the mind's inherent structure, making possible universal and necessary knowledge, categorical imperative and moral philosophy. Kant's second major work, The Critique of Practical Reason, explores moral philosophy. He famously formulated the categorical imperative as the supreme principle of morality. Universalizability. Principle: act only according to that maxim whereby you can at the same time will that it should become a universal law. Humanity formula: act so that you treat humanity, whether in your own person or in that of another, always as an end and never as a means only. Kant argues that moral obligations stem from reason alone, not from empirical considerations of happiness or utility. A rational will must recognize universal moral laws as binding, thereby giving autonomy a central role in ethical life. By grounding ethics in pure practical reason, Kant claims to safeguard the objectivity and universality of moral duties, aesthetics and teleology. In the Critique of the Power of Judgment, Kant addresses aesthetics, offering a nuanced account of beauty and the sublime. Aesthetic judgments, he argues, involve a free play between imagination and understanding, provoking pleasure without direct reference to concepts or practical utility. This subjective yet universal claim, beauty as something that ought to please all, has shaped modern debates in art theory. Kant also discusses teleological judgment, examining how we interpret organisms and nature as if they have purposes. While rejecting a strictly empiricist reading of biological processes, he maintains that teleology remains a regulative principle, guiding scientific inquiry without asserting final metaphysical truths. Critiques, limits, and enlightenment. Kant's critical project aims to delineate the boundaries of reason. He denies the validity of speculative metaphysics that attempts to prove God's existence or the immortality of the soul through theoretical reason. However, he preserves space for faith in a practical sense, asserting that moral law leads us to postulate God and immortality as necessary conditions for the highest good. In an essay titled What is Enlightenment? 1784, Kant describes enlightenment as humanity's emergence from self-imposed immaturity, championing the motto sapere aude, dare to know. His emphasis on autonomy, reason, and the public use of one's intellect significantly influenced the Enlightenment ethos, shaping modern liberal thought. Influence and aftermath. Kant's philosophy triggered a wave of responses in German idealism, with figures like Fichte, Schelling, and Hegel striving to expand or modify Kant's ideas. They found Kant's distinction between phenomena and noumena unsatisfying, seeking a more comprehensive unity of subject and object. Schopenhauer critiqued Kant's optimism, yet preserved much of his framework, recasting the noumenal as the will. In the 20th century, the neo-Kantian movement revitalized Kant's epistemology, particularly in the Marburg and Southwest schools, influencing philosophers like Ernst Cassirer and sociologists like Max Weber. Kant's moral philosophy also heavily shaped deontological ethics, with contemporary thinkers like John Rawls drawing upon Kantian principles in constructing theories of justice. Contemporary relevance. Kant's insights into the active role of cognition remain foundational in discussions on mind and perception, resonating with developments in cognitive science. His moral theory, with its emphasis on dignity and autonomy, underpins many human rights frameworks. Debates on free will and determinism also reference Kant's distinction between empirical causality and the intelligible character of the moral agent. Critics today question whether Kant's rigid a priori forms adequately capture the complexity of knowledge, given advances in quantum physics and neuroscience that challenge classical notions of space, time, and causality. Others critique Kant's moral philosophy for downplaying the role of emotions, relationships, and social contexts in ethical decision-making. Nonetheless, Immanuel Kant remains an indispensable figure in the history of ideas. His attempt to chart the limits of reason, affirm moral autonomy, and justify a universal framework for knowledge continues to inspire and provoke. Whether one sees his system as a definitive resolution or a starting point for further inquiry, Kant's critical approach stands as a monumental achievement, reshaping the trajectory of Western philosophy and echoing in contemporary debates across ethics, epistemology, aesthetics, and beyond. Elefte Georg Wilhelm Friedrich Hegel, Galfiads til Treogfiers. Georg Wilhelm Friedrich Hegel was born in Stuttgart in the Duchy of Württemberg, now part of Germany, in 1770. Rising to prominence in the early 19th century, Hegel shaped a system of absolute idealism that would profoundly influence continental philosophy, political theory, and even modern theology. His views on history, dialectics, and the unfolding of spirit, Geist, remain touchstones for discussions about reason, freedom, and progress. A brief biography. Hegel's formative years were marked by the intellectual ferment of the late Enlightenment and the revolutionary upheavals that followed in France. He studied theology at the Tübinger Stift, rooming with Friedrich Hölderlin, the poet, and Friedrich Schelling, the philosopher. After a period of private tutoring, Hegel took up various academic posts, eventually securing a professorship at the University of Berlin in 1818. During his Berlin years, Hegel became the preeminent philosopher in German-speaking lands, delivering influential lectures on world history, the philosophy of religion, art, and politics. Hegel's major works include Phenomenology of Spirit, 1807, Science of Logic, 1812 to 1816, Encyclopedia of the Philosophical Sciences, 1817 and subsequent editions, and Elements of the Philosophy of Right, 1820. He died suddenly in 1831 during a cholera outbreak, leaving behind a legacy that would stir passionate debate among supporters and critics for generations. Dialectics and the Phenomenology of Spirit. Hegel's name is nearly synonymous with dialectic. While many philosophers before him utilized forms of dialectical reasoning, Hegel transformed it into a dynamic principle governing reality and thought itself. In broad terms, Hegelian dialectics involve a three-step pattern, often labeled somewhat simplistically as thesis, antithesis, and synthesis. The tension between contradictory elements drives development, eventually leading to a higher unity that incorporates the truths of both sides. In the Phenomenology of Spirit, Hegel tracks the journey of consciousness from sense certainty to absolute knowing. This epic exploration shows how each stage of consciousness contains internal contradictions that prompt a transformation into a higher stage. One famous section is the master-slave dialectic, where self-consciousness emerges most clearly in the dynamic of domination and subordination. Ultimately, both master and slave recognize a mutual dependency, illustrating how human identity arises through social relations. The life of the spirit is not the life that shrinks from death and keeps itself untouched by devastation, but rather the life that endures it and maintains itself in it. Here Hegel emphasizes that growth, be it intellectual, social, or spiritual, requires wrestling with contradiction, negativity, and even despair. Absolute idealism and spirit. Hegel is classed as an absolute idealist because he contends that all reality is the manifestation of a single, rational, and dynamic spirit, Geist. Unlike subjective idealists such as Berkeley, who emphasize the mind dependence of phenomena, or transcendent idealists, like Kant, who distinguishes between phenomena and noumena, Hegel posits that reason itself is embedded in the world's unfolding. Reality is rational, and reason is real, two sides of the same coin. The full actuality of spirit is realized through history. As civilizations rise and fall, as philosophies and religions evolve, spirit becomes increasingly self-conscious. In this sense, history is not random but teleological, aiming toward a rational freedom in which spirit knows itself in and through human institutions, family, civil society, the state, and cultural expressions, art, religion, philosophy. Philosophy of history. Hegel's lectures on the philosophy of history articulate a grand narrative in which world history is the progress of the consciousness of freedom. According to Hegel, ancient societies recognized freedom only for a ruling few, e.g., masters, aristocrats, while others were subjugated. Over time, awareness of universal freedom expanded, culminating in Hegel's view in modern constitutional states. Although he believed the Prussian state of his day embodied the apex of rational governance, later thinkers criticized him for over-identifying an existing regime with the end of history. Still, Hegel's vision that history follows a rational pattern, whereby contradictions are resolved at increasingly comprehensive levels, continues to fascinate. His aphorism that the owl of Minerva spreads its wings only with the falling of the dusk suggests that philosophical understanding arrives after historical realities have already taken shape, underscoring how we comprehend the meaning of events in retrospect. The philosophy of right and political thought. In Elements of the Philosophy of Right, Hegel explores the structure of ethical life, Sittlichkeit, focusing on family, civil society, and the state. The state, for Hegel, is not a mere instrument but the embodiment of ethical freedom. He distinguishes between abstract right, the domain of property and law, where individuals claim rights. Morality, the realm of subjective conscience and intention. Ethical life, the integration of personal freedom with social institutions, culminating in the state as the highest expression of communal freedom. What is rational is actual, and what is actual is rational. This often misunderstood statement underscores Hegel's belief that, at a certain level, the real world, especially its political structures, is the manifestation of rational necessity. Critics have branded this as quietism or a justification of the status quo. Defenders argue that Hegel also recognizes the transient, evolving character of institutions that must continually surpass themselves. Religion, art, and philosophy. Hegel saw religion, art, and philosophy as three modes through which spirit expresses itself. Art presents truth in sensory form, religion in imaginative or representational form, and philosophy in conceptual form. Ultimately, philosophy is the highest mode of apprehending truth because it employs reason to think the absolute explicitly. Though a Protestant in background, Hegel engaged with Catholic and classical religious traditions, interpreting them through his idealist lens. He believed Christianity's doctrine of incarnation symbolized a deep metaphysical truth, spirit becoming manifest in the finite world. Still, many theologians attacked Hegel for seeming to reduce God to a process of historical self-consciousness rather than a personal, transcendent being. Critiques and legacy. Hegel's dense prose style and sweeping system drew controversy. 19th-century critics like Arthur Schopenhauer dismissed him as an obscure builder of castles in the air, yet his legacy has been immense. Left-wing Hegelians, including Ludwig Feuerbach, Bruno Bauer, and eventually Karl Marx, reinterpreted Hegel's dialectic in materialist terms, emphasizing social and economic contradictions. Right-wing Hegelians tended to view Hegel's absolute idealism as a buttress of conservative or nationalistic ideals. In the 20th century, existentialist and phenomenological currents often rejected Hegel's totalizing system, though they sometimes borrowed his emphasis on negation and becoming. In analytic philosophy, Hegelianism was long viewed with suspicion, but recent decades have seen renewed interest in his logic, his theory of recognition, and his philosophical approach to social norms. Thinkers such as Alexandre Koyev and Jean Hippolyte in France, and later Robert Brandom in the Anglophone world, have shown how Hegel's ideas about self-consciousness and recognition prefigure contemporary debates about intersubjectivity and normativity. Moreover, Hegel's conception of master-slave relations resonates with discussions of domination, emancipation, and the politics of identity. Continuing relevance. Hegel's attempt to reconcile unity and difference, reason and history remains compelling. His dialectical method suggests that conflicts and contradictions are not mere dead ends, but vital moments in a larger developmental arc. Such thinking resonates with fields like psychoanalysis, cultural studies, political theory, and even certain interpretations of quantum mechanics, where contradictions can spawn new frameworks of understanding. In practical terms, Hegel's assertion that freedom emerges through social and historical processes spurs debates on constitutional law, collective identity, and the nature of progress. The tension between universal ideals and the real-world institutions that purport to embody them is a central concern in contemporary political discourses. In short, Georg Wilhelm Friedrich Hegel stands as a pivotal figure who attempted nothing less than a grand synthesis of philosophy, history, art, religion, and politics. By seeing contradiction as a dynamic force driving reason's unfolding, he offered a vision of reality in perpetual development. Whether lauded as a visionary or critiqued as overly systematic, Hegel remains a fulcrum around which modern thought turns, forever challenging us to discern the rational shape of our shared historical journey. Weihnachten Arthur Schopenhauer, 1788–1860. Arthur Schopenhauer was born in Danzig, now Gdansk, Poland, in 1788, the son of a wealthy merchant family. Often considered the philosophical pessimist par excellence, Schopenhauer diverged sharply from the optimistic currents in post-Kantian idealism, particularly Hegel's systematic confidence in reason and progress. Instead, Schopenhauer declared that the underlying essence of reality is the blind, ceaseless will, a force that cannot be fully satisfied and therefore condemns human existence to suffering. A brief biography. Schopenhauer spent his early life traveling across Europe, gaining fluency in several languages and absorbing various cultural influences. He studied at the University of Göttingen, first pursuing medicine before turning to philosophy. Schopenhauer's doctoral dissertation, On the Fourfold Root of the Principle of Sufficient Reason, 1813, set out his initial views on the structure of knowledge. He later settled in Weimar, where he associated with Goethe and was exposed to Eastern thought, particularly Buddhism and Hindu texts, which would deeply inform his worldview. In 1818, Schopenhauer published his magnum opus, The World as Will and Representation. Initially overshadowed by the towering influence of Hegel in Berlin, Schopenhauer struggled for academic recognition. Only in his later years did he attain fame, eventually influencing a generation of writers, musicians, and philosophers, including Richard Wagner, Friedrich Nietzsche, and Thomas Mann. The World as Will and Representation. Schopenhauer's central insight is that the phenomenal world, what we perceive as objects in space and time, is representation, Vorstellung, shaped by the human mind, following Kant's transcendental idealism. Yet beneath the realm of representation lies an inner essence that Schopenhauer names will. This will is not a rational or benevolent spirit, as in Hegel's spirit, but rather a blind, striving force that manifests in all living beings. We can regard every living thing as the embodiment of the will to live, indeed as one of the infinite manifestations of that will. Because will is insatiable and perpetually longing, existence is marked by suffering, frustration, and conflict. For Schopenhauer, to live is to will, and to will is to suffer, since no desire remains satisfied for long, and even fleeting satisfaction soon gives way to new desires or boredom. Pessimism and the suffering of life. Schopenhauer's philosophical pessimism famously challenges notions of progress or inherent goodness in the universe. He views life as fundamentally irrational. Every living creature strives for survival and reproduction, caught in the cycle of desire, fleeting gratification, and subsequent dissatisfaction. For Schopenhauer, the moral corollary of this cosmic predicament is compassion. Recognizing the shared nature of suffering among all sentient beings can foster empathy and ethical behavior. He frequently praises the moral teaching of Buddhism, which acknowledges suffering dukkha as a fundamental aspect of existence and prescribes compassion as a cardinal virtue. Aesthetics as temporary redemption. While Schopenhauer paints a grim picture of life's incessant strife, he offers avenues for temporary escape. One is through art and aesthetic contemplation. In encountering great art, especially music, one transcends individual willing and contemplates universal ideas. Schopenhauer singles out music as the most profound art form because it directly embodies will's movements without the mediation of conceptual representation. For him, music is akin to a universal language that resonates with our deepest emotional states. Music expresses only the quintessence of life and of its events, never these themselves. This aesthetic experience momentarily liberates the individual from the demands of the will, offering a respite of pure, disinterested observation. Although fleeting, such moments hint at a possibility of stepping outside the chain of suffering. The denial of the will. Another path Schopenhauer proposes is the renunciation of the will itself, akin to ascetic practices found in certain religious traditions. Through asceticism and the cultivation of compassion, a person can gradually negate personal desires, achieving a state Schopenhauer likens to a form of quietude or resignation. While he does not promise blissful union with a deity in the Christian sense, he sees parallels in the saintly or monastic life that reduces the tyranny of desire. This deeply personal, almost mystical dimension of Schopenhauer's thought resonated with existentialists and other anti-systematic philosophers who questioned the sufficiency of reason to capture the depths of human anguish and longing. Critique of Hegel and academic philosophy. Schopenhauer famously despised the Hegelian system, lambasting Hegel as an intellectual fraud who enshrouded trivialities in obtuse language. He called the academic climate of his day a philosophical charlatanry, and his attempt to lecture concurrently with Hegel at the University of Berlin ended in humiliation. His classroom remained empty while Hegel drew throngs of students. This hostility was partly temperament but also ideological. Schopenhauer believed Hegelian optimism about reason's march through history ignored the brute facts of suffering. He saw little point in a system that described history as rational, or culminating in political institutions that claimed to embody freedom. Instead, Schopenhauer insisted that no dialectical progress can overcome the fundamental dissatisfaction at life's core. Influence on Nietzsche, Freud, and beyond. Despite his early obscurity, Schopenhauer's fortunes turned mid-century. He gained an enthusiastic following, influencing literary figures, Turgenev, Tolstoy, Thomas Hardy, composers, Wegner, and philosophers, Friedrich Nietzsche, most famously. Nietzsche initially embraced Schopenhauer's aesthetic redemption and tragic outlook before breaking away and critiquing Schopenhauer's ascetic stance as life-denying. Sigmund Freud was likewise drawn to Schopenhauer's depiction of unconscious desire and primal drives, seeing in it a precursor to his own theory of libido. In the 20th century, existentialists such as Albert Camus and Jean-Paul Sartre also grappled with Schopenhauerian themes of absurdity and the burdens of freedom, though they typically rejected Schopenhauer's counsel of renunciation. Schopenhauer's integration of Eastern thought into Western philosophy was pioneering, foreshadowing later cross-cultural dialogues. He cited the Upanishads and Buddhism as major inspirations for his metaphysics of the will and the possibility of its negation. Lasting legacy. Modern scholarship recognizes Schopenhauer as a crucial bridge between Kantian philosophy and existential phenomenological lines of inquiry. While Kant declared the noumenon unknowable, Schopenhauer posited will as at least partially knowable through our own internal striving. This step introduced a more psychological and affective dimension to metaphysics. Furthermore, Schopenhauer's emphasis on compassion anticipates ethical frameworks that prioritize empathy and the reduction of suffering over abstract moral laws. His reputation as a philosopher of pessimism endures, but many find in Schopenhauer a poignant honesty about human vulnerability. His aesthetic theory prefigures ideas about art's power to transport us beyond everyday strife and open up deeper layers of experience. In secular contexts, Schopenhauer's reflections on suffering and the possibility of transcending desire continue to resonate with readers who find neither systematic rationalism nor orthodox religion adequate to account for the existential dimension of life. The question remains whether Schopenhauer's counsel to deny the will is a practicable solution or merely a form of philosophical asceticism. Yet his profound influence on 19th and 20th century thought cannot be denied. In an age torn between the bright faith in progress and the dark realities of conflict, Arthur Schopenhauer's voice endures as a reminder that the primal forces within us, and their capacity to inflict suffering, are neither trivial nor easily subdued. Even so, his work invites us to seek moments of reprieve in beauty, compassion, and the introspective quest to understand the will that moves us all. Trinity, John Stuart Mill, 1806–1873. John Stuart Mill was an English philosopher, political economist, and civil servant who became the leading figure of 19th-century liberal thought. Renowned for his advocacy of individual liberty, social and political reform, and the utilitarian ethical framework, Mill's works remain cornerstones of liberal democracy, shaping debates around free speech, women's rights, and representative government. A brief biography. Mill was born in London in 1806, the son of Scottish philosopher and historian James Mill, who subjected him to an intense, rigorously structured education from an early age. By the age of 8, Mill had read classical Greek authors, and he began learning Latin soon thereafter. The younger Mill's early intellectual brilliance, however, came at the cost of personal stress, leading to a mental crisis in his early 20s. Seeking a more balanced emotional life, Mill turned to poetry, music, and the writings of romantic authors, especially William Wordsworth. He joined the East India Company in 1823, ascending to important administrative roles and contributing to policy discussions related to British governance of India. Politically active, Mill also served in Parliament, 1865 to 1868. His landmark works, A System of Logic, 1843, On Liberty, 1859, Utilitarianism, 1863, The Subjection of Women, 1869, form the core of his intellectual legacy. Utilitarian ethics. Mill inherited the principles of utilitarianism from Jeremy Bentham, who declared the greatest happiness of the greatest number as the guiding moral principle. However, Mill refined Bentham's approach. Bentham tended to treat all pleasures as quantitatively comparable, whereas Mill distinguished between higher and lower pleasures. For Mill, intellectual and moral pleasures outrank purely bodily or trivial amusements. It is better to be a human being dissatisfied than a pig satisfied, better to be Socrates dissatisfied than a fool satisfied. Thus, Mill introduced a qualitative dimension to utilitarianism, arguing that the cultivation of our higher faculties, intellect, creativity, moral sense, is essential for genuine well-being. He maintained that utility, correctly understood, supports individual autonomy and moral development, not just the crude aggregation of pleasure. Liberty and the harm principle. In On Liberty, Mill famously defends freedom of expression and individual autonomy as cornerstones of a flourishing society. His core argument is that the only legitimate reason for exercising power over any member of a civilized community, against his will, is to prevent harm to others. This harm principle set boundaries on social and governmental interference in personal conduct. The only purpose for which power can be rightfully exercised over any member of a civilized community against his will is to prevent harm to others. Mill's rationale is partly utilitarian. He argues that free competition of ideas fosters intellectual development, social progress, and truth-seeking. Even false ideas serve a function by sharpening understanding of true ones. His robust defense of liberty, particularly freedom of speech, continues to inform legal and ethical discussions about censorship, civil rights, and the permissible limits of state intervention. Democracy and representative government. In his work, Considerations on Representative Government, 1861, Mill examines the conditions under which democracy best promotes the common good. He advocates for broad political participation, but also warns against the tyranny of the majority. To ensure competence in governance, Mill proposes weighted voting for educated individuals and emphasizes the importance of plural voting systems, though this aspect of his thought has been critiqued as elitist. Despite these reservations, Mill endorses representative institutions as superior to aristocratic or autocratic systems. He emphasizes the moral and educational value of participation, arguing that democratic engagement cultivates virtue, responsibility, and a sense of common purpose. Women's rights and the subjection of women. One of Mill's most groundbreaking contributions was his vehement advocacy for women's equality. In The Subjection of Women, he challenges the entrenched legal and social barriers that limited women's participation in education, work, and public life. Mill contends that denying women equal rights and opportunities wastes half of humanity's potential. The principle which regulates the existing social relations between the two sexes is wrong in itself, and now one of the chief hindrances to human improvement. He draws parallels between the legal subjugation of women and earlier forms of slavery or serfdom, insisting that only through equal liberty can societies realize full moral and intellectual flourishing. This text was radical for its time and helped galvanize early feminist movements in Britain and beyond. Scientific method and inductive logic. Mill's philosophical interests were not confined to ethics and politics. In A System of Logic, he elaborated a theory of inductive reasoning, Mill's methods, that aimed to clarify how we infer causal relationships from observed patterns. These methods, such as the method of agreement and the method of difference, remain influential in scientific methodology and empirical research. However, Mill's empiricism also placed him in dialogue with broader philosophical currents. While he upheld the premise that knowledge arises primarily through experience, he recognized the complexity of abstract principles and the necessity of certain explanatory frameworks. His moderate stance sought to maintain empiricist rigor without denying the role of conceptual analysis. Critiques and influence. Mill's fusion of utilitarian ethics and liberal politics was not without detractors. Some critics argue that the principle of utility can undermine individual rights if the majority's happiness outweighs minority interests. Moreover, Mill's distinction between higher and lower pleasures has been challenged as elitist or too subjective in its valuation of what counts as higher. Conservative thinkers in the 19th century labeled Mill's emphasis on individuality as permissive moral relativism, warning it would erode traditional social bonds. Marxists, for their part, considered Mill's liberalism insufficiently critical of economic power structures and social inequalities that limit genuine freedom. Nonetheless, Mill's influence on liberal democratic thought is profound. Libertarian theorists build on his harm principle to advocate minimal state intervention in personal conduct, while modern social liberals extend his arguments to justify government action in ensuring fair opportunities and rectifying social injustices. Mill's nuanced approach to free speech, insisting that even unpopular or offensive ideas deserve a hearing, forms a bedrock principle in many contemporary liberal societies, though debates about hate speech, misinformation, and censorship persist. Modern resonance. Mill's legacy in political philosophy and ethics continues to resonate, especially in debates about paternalism, drug legalization, free speech on digital platforms, and the balancing of individual liberties with collective well-being. His essay on liberty remains a staple text in university courses on political philosophy, and his argument for the importance of dissent and nonconformity has gained renewed relevance in a world of echo chambers and algorithmically curated opinions. His feminist arguments, while couched in Victorian terms, anticipate many lines of reasoning in modern gender theory, emphasizing the systematic oppression of women and calling for legal and cultural reforms. Likewise, his belief in the formative power of civic engagement speaks to contemporary efforts to strengthen democratic institutions and citizen participation. On a broader level, Mill's intellectual biography, balancing the rigor of early utilitarianism with a deeply felt appreciation for poetry, the arts, and human emotion, illustrates the possibility of harmonizing rational moral theory with a full understanding of human flourishing. By integrating concerns about personal development, emotional well-being, and social progress under the umbrella of utility, he offered a more humane utilitarianism than Bentham's initial formulations. In conclusion, John Stuart Mill remains a towering figure of liberal philosophy, whose explorations of liberty, ethics, democracy, and women's rights continue to shape discourse in the humanities and social sciences. Whether one aligns with his utilitarian premises or critiques them from other moral standpoints, Mill's insistence on individual sovereignty, free debate, and the ongoing quest for human improvement stands at the heart of modern liberal ideals. His works underscore a vision of social progress, achieved through reasoned discussion, personal development, and the fearless defense of freedom. Values that, while tested in each new generation, still form the backbone of many democratic societies around the globe. 14. Karl Marx, 1818 to 1883. Karl Marx was a German philosopher, economist, historian, and journalist, whose revolutionary critique of capitalism gave rise to one of the most influential political and economic ideologies in modern history, Marxism. Born in Trier, Prussia, now Germany, in 1818, Marx spent much of his life in exile, collaborating with Friedrich Engels to develop a theoretical framework that combined German philosophy, English political economy, and French socialist thought. A brief biography. Marx studied law and philosophy at the universities of Bonn and Berlin, heavily influenced by the young Hegelians who sought to radicalize Hegel's dialectics. After a brief stint as editor of a liberal newspaper, Marx was forced into exile due to his political writings. He settled eventually in London, supported intermittently by Engels' financial aid. During his London years, Marx conducted extensive research in the British Museum, culminating in his magnum opus, Das Kapital, Volume 1 published in 1867, Volumes 2 and 3 published posthumously by Engels. He also penned the Communist Manifesto, 1848, alongside Engels, a concise political pamphlet that popularized key Marxist concepts. Marx died in London in 1883, leaving behind a body of work that would spark revolutions and political experiments across the globe. Dialectical materialism. Marx adapted Hegel's dialectical method, which emphasized conflict and contradiction as drivers of historical development. But while Hegel saw history as the self-realization of spirit, Marx rooted his analysis in material conditions, specifically how human societies produce and reproduce the necessities of life. This materialist approach posits that economic structures, the base, fundamentally shape political, social, and cultural institutions, the superstructure. It is not the consciousness of men that determines their being, but on the contrary, their social being that determines their consciousness. This perspective, labeled dialectical materialism, means that contradictions in the economic base, most notably between the forces of production, technology, labor power, and the relations of production, property rights, class structures, propel historical change. Historical materialism and class struggle. Marx's theory of history, often called historical materialism, identifies class struggle as the primary engine of societal transformation. In feudal societies, the conflict was between nobility and serfs. In capitalist societies, it is between the bourgeoisie, owners of the means of production, and the proletariat, workers who sell their labor. According to Marx, capitalism is marked by inherent contradictions. Exploitation. The bourgeoisie extracts surplus value from the labor of the proletariat. Alienation. Workers become estranged from the products of their labor, from their fellow workers, and from their own species being, creative potential. Overproduction. Competitive markets drive rapid technological innovation and relentless pursuit of profit, leading to cyclical crises of overproduction and economic downturns. Marx believed these tensions would eventually lead to a proletarian revolution, overthrowing the capitalist class and inaugurating a socialist and eventually communist society, where the means of production are collectively owned. The Communist Manifesto. Co-authored with Engels in 1848, the Communist Manifesto remains one of the most influential political texts in history. Opening with the famous lines, "A spectre is haunting Europe, the spectre of communism," the manifesto calls for the working class to unite and overthrow the bourgeois system. It critiques the exploitation inherent in capitalism and envisions a future in which class divisions dissolve. The history of all hitherto existing society is the history of class struggles. This pithy statement condenses Marx's belief that all major historical eras have been defined by class antagonisms, from masters and slaves in antiquity to lords and serfs in feudalism, and now bourgeoisie and proletariat under capitalism. Das Kapital und Kritik der politischen Ökonomie. While the manifesto was a rallying cry, Marx's theoretical depth is best exhibited in Das Kapital. Here, he offers a systemic critique of capitalism, unraveling how commodities derive their value, how labor is sold as a commodity, and how capital accumulates. His concept of surplus value, workers producing more value in a day than the cost of their wages, explains how profits arise through exploitation. Capitalists reinvest these profits to expand production and dominate markets, perpetuating inequality and alienation. Marx also analyzed the role of machinery and technological progress, which can elevate productivity but also intensify worker alienation and wage suppression. The cyclical crises of capitalism, in Marx's view, reflect structural instabilities that no amount of reform can rectify. Alienation and human potential. Central to Marx's vision is the idea that human beings are inherently creative and collaborative. Under capitalism, however, workers lose control over their labor and its products, transforming that labor into an alien force. This alienation undermines human flourishing, reducing people to cogs in the profit-driven machine. Marx's ideal is a society where individuals collectively control production, thus reclaiming their humanity and abolishing exploitative class relations. Marx and Engels' collaboration. Friedrich Engels was Marx's closest intellectual and political ally, providing both financial and editorial support. Engels' own work, such as The Condition of the Working Class in England, underscored the harsh realities of industrial capitalism. Together, they refined the concept of historical materialism, actively participated in socialist organizations, and corresponded with an international network of radicals. Engels oversaw the publication of the second and third volumes of Das Kapital after Marx's death, ensuring Marx's ideas reached a growing audience. Legacy and controversies. Marx's writings inspired revolutionary movements worldwide, most famously the Bolshevik Revolution in Russia, 1917. Throughout the 20th century, many states claimed to implement Marxist principles, most notably the Soviet Union and the People's Republic of China, though critics argue that these regimes deviated significantly from Marx's original vision, often resulting in authoritarian governance and economic inefficiencies. Western democracies also felt Marx's influence through social democratic reforms, labor rights, and welfare policies aimed at mitigating the harshest inequalities of capitalism. Some maintain that these reforms were partial victories for Marx's critique, even if they stopped short of revolution. Academic debate rages on about the interpretation of Marx. Critics condemn him for allegedly overlooking the complexities of markets, technological innovation, and the role of culture beyond economics. They also point to the authoritarian tendencies in self-proclaimed Marxist regimes, questioning whether such outcomes are inherent in Marx's framework or merely historical accidents. Supporters, however, highlight Marx's incisive analysis of exploitation and systemic inequality, seeing him as an essential voice in critiques of capitalism and global neoliberal policies. In philosophy, Marx's base superstructure model and dialectical approach heavily influenced disciplines like sociology, critical theory, cultural studies, and political economy. The Frankfurt School, for instance, integrated Marxian insights with Freudian psychoanalysis to probe cultural forms of domination. Modern relevance. In today's globalized economy, marked by massive corporations, precarious labor conditions, and periodic financial crises, Marx's critique of exploitation and class power remains potent. The concentration of wealth in the hands of a few, the gig economy's reliance on flexible labor, and environmental crises linked to unrestrained production all echo concerns Marx raised over a century ago. New theoretical currents, such as neo-Marxism, post-Marxism, and Marxist feminism, adapt and extend Marx's thought to address contemporary issues, ranging from identity politics to ecological sustainability. Some theorists argue that Marx's emphasis on class struggle should be integrated with analyses of race, gender, and colonialism to fully explain modern inequalities. Despite the controversies, Karl Marx stands as a towering intellect whose ideas shaped much of 20th century politics and continue to fuel debates about justice, equality, and the nature of historical change. His assertion that capitalism contains the seeds of its own demise resonates in ongoing questions about whether systemic contradictions, rising inequality, environmental limits, technological displacement, will eventually require a radical restructuring of society. While the revolutionary outcomes Marx predicted have taken paths he could not have fully foreseen, his enduring influence testifies to the depth and breadth of his philosophical vision. 15. Friedrich Nietzsche, 1844 to 1900. Friedrich Nietzsche was a German philosopher, cultural critic and philologist whose provocative style and unorthodox ideas challenged the moral and philosophical foundations of Western civilization. Born in Röcken, in what was then the Prussian province of Saxony, Nietzsche's intellectual journey took him through the study of classical philology before he embarked on a radical critique of religion, morality, and the notion of objective truth. His aphoristic prose, combined with a tendency to turn conventional wisdom on its head, ensured that he became one of the most controversial and influential thinkers of modern times. A brief biography. Nietzsche showed scholarly brilliance early in life, studying classical philology at the University of Bonn and later at Leipzig. At just 24, he became a professor of philology at the University of Basel, Switzerland, a post he resigned less than a decade later due to health issues and philosophical conflicts. Plagued by migraines, poor eyesight, and other ailments, Nietzsche led a mostly solitary existence in Switzerland, Italy, and France, writing feverishly between bouts of illness. Major works include The Birth of Tragedy, 1872, Thus Spoke Zarathustra, 1883–85, Beyond Good and Evil, 1886, On the Genealogy of Morality, 1887, and The Twilight of the Idols, 1889. In 1889, Nietzsche suffered a mental collapse from which he never recovered, spending his final years incapacitated under the care of his mother and sister. He died in 1900, unaware of the posthumous fame and infamy his writings would generate. The Death of God and Critique of Christianity. Nietzsche's declaration that God is dead is among his most famous and misunderstood pronouncements. He did not necessarily celebrate this death, which he saw as a cultural event in which Enlightenment rationality, scientific progress, and historical criticism of the Bible had eroded the foundations of Christian faith. By pronouncing God dead, Nietzsche meant that the West could no longer ground its morality or sense of meaning in a transcendent deity. This loss, Nietzsche warned, would create a crisis of values. God is dead, God remains dead, and we have killed him. Rather than urging a return to faith, Nietzsche challenged modernity to forge new forms of meaning beyond Christian morality, which he considered rooted in resentment and self-denial. Master-slave morality and the will to power. In works like Beyond Good and Evil and On the Genealogy of Morality, Nietzsche develops a radical moral psychology. He argues that traditional morality, particularly Christian morality, is a slave morality, born from the resentment of the weak against the strong. Qualities like meekness and humility, originally signs of weakness, become moral virtues, while power and nobility are recast as vices. In contrast, master morality arises from those who affirm life, take risks, and create values. Nietzsche does not advocate a return to archaic forms of domination. Rather, he calls for a revaluation of all values, urging individuals to break free from herd instinct and shape their own moral codes. Central to Nietzsche's thought is the will to power, a concept describing the fundamental driving force behind human behavior, and in some interpretations, all of life. This will to power is not simply a will to domination over others. It also encompasses creative self-expression, spiritual aspiration, and the artistic drive to shape the world. The Übermensch, Overman, and eternal recurrence. In Thus Spoke Zarathustra, Nietzsche introduces two key ideas, the Übermensch and the doctrine of eternal recurrence. Übermensch. Often mistranslated as Superman, the Übermensch is the figure who overcomes the merely human condition, inventing new values and living life as a creative work of art. The Übermensch exemplifies strength, vitality, and the capacity to say yes to life, even with all its suffering. Eternal recurrence. Nietzsche challenges us to imagine that our lives, exactly as we live them, will recur infinitely. Would we embrace this fate or feel crushed by it? Those who can affirm life so completely that they would welcome its endless repetition demonstrate the highest form of life affirmation. These ideas are highly poetic and open to multiple interpretations. Some read the Übermensch as an individualistic hero, while others see a more communal or existential challenge to humanity to surpass itself. Similarly, the eternal recurrence is read either as a literal cosmological hypothesis or a thought experiment aimed at revealing one's deepest attitudes toward existence. Critique of truth and perspectivism. Nietzsche famously undermined the notion of objective truth. Arguing that all knowledge is interpretive, he introduced the concept of perspectivism, suggesting that any claim to truth is bound up with the perspective and interests of the knower. This stance does not necessarily entail complete relativism. Rather, Nietzsche insists that we acknowledge the role of power, subjectivity, and interpretation in shaping what we call truth. There are no eternal facts, as there are no absolute truths. This line of thinking influenced later schools of thought, such as postmodernism, which question the universality of rationality and objective standards. Influence and misuse. After Nietzsche's collapse and death, his sister, Elisabeth Förster Nietzsche, took control of his literary estate. She distorted some of his writings and selectively edited his work to align with her German nationalist and anti-Semitic views. This paved the way for the appropriation of Nietzsche's ideas by the Nazi regime, despite the fact that Nietzsche himself despised German nationalism and anti-Semitism and held an international, free-spirited outlook. In the 20th century, existentialists like Jean-Paul Sartre and Albert Camus saw in Nietzsche a precursor who highlighted the individual's responsibility to forge meaning in an absurd world. Philosophers in the continental tradition, Foucault, Deleuze, Derrida, drew heavily on Nietzsche's genealogical method, his critique of truth, and his interest in power dynamics. In the Anglophone world, Nietzsche's earlier reception was less pronounced, though analytic philosophers later engaged with his moral psychology and literary style. Pessimism and life affirmation. Despite his reputation for nihilism, Nietzsche viewed himself as offering a path beyond nihilism, where nihilism is the condition of believing in no values at all after the collapse of old certainties. By urging a revaluation of all values, Nietzsche hoped individuals would embrace life with all its suffering and become creators of meaning. His emphasis on vitality and personal excellence reflects a life-affirming spirit, even though he rejects the consolations of a transcendent morality. What does not kill me makes me stronger. Such aphorisms testify to a heroic stance in the face of adversity, though Nietzsche's existential sincerity can be unsettling. He neither promises redemption nor denies life's brutality. Instead, he insists on embracing the drama of existence and harnessing it for creative self-overcoming. Continuing relevance. Nietzsche's work remains a flashpoint in contemporary debates on ethics, politics, theology, and psychology. His dismantling of the foundations of Christian moral systems resonates in secular age critiques, while his assertion that new values must be created calls into question any morality that presents itself as self-evidently universal. Scholars of modern culture often turn to Nietzsche to explain phenomena of crisis in authority, the allure of radical ideologies, and the search for authenticity. In moral philosophy, Nietzsche challenges the assumption that ethics can be grounded in reason alone, highlighting instead the roles of power, instincts, and creativity. In the 21st century, artists, writers, and thinkers still find inspiration in Nietzsche's call to live dangerously and question accepted norms. Meanwhile, the potential for misreading or politically weaponizing Nietzsche's ideas remains, a testament to their provocative and ambiguous nature. In sum, Friedrich Nietzsche stands as a figure both revered and reviled, whose incisive critiques shattered comforting illusions about God, morality, and truth. By inviting us to face the abyss of meaninglessness with courage, humor, and creativity, Nietzsche remains a compelling voice for those seeking to navigate the complexities of modern life. His legacy is a testament to the power of philosophy when it dares to unsettle our deepest certainties and demand a reckoning with the raw forces that shape human existence. 16. Ludwig Wittgenstein, 1889 1951. Ludwig Wittgenstein was an Austrian-British philosopher who profoundly influenced the course of 20th-century analytic philosophy, especially in the areas of logic, language, and the philosophy of mind. Born into a wealthy Viennese family in 1889, Wittgenstein renounced a life of privilege to pursue a rigorous inquiry into the limits of language and thought. Over two distinct phases, his early work culminating in the Tractatus Logico-Philosophicus, 1921, and his later work represented by Philosophical Investigations, published posthumously in 1953, Wittgenstein reshaped the analytic tradition, questioning the very nature of philosophical problems. A brief biography. Wittgenstein studied engineering in Berlin and Manchester before a growing fascination with the foundations of mathematics led him to Cambridge, where he was mentored by Bertrand Russell. During World War I, he served in the Austro-Hungarian army, composing much of the Tractatus in his notebooks on the front lines. After the war, he believed he had solved all major philosophical problems and stepped away from academia, donating his inheritance and working as a village schoolteacher and a gardener at a monastery. In the late 1920s, Wittgenstein returned to Cambridge, stimulated by new challenges in logic and mathematics. He revised many positions from the Tractatus in what came to be known as his later philosophy. Teaching at Cambridge for much of the 1930s and 1940s, he engaged students with radical new ideas on language, thought, and the nature of philosophical inquiry. He died in 1951, just days after completing revisions on parts of his later work. The Tractatus Logico-Philosophicus. Published in 1921, the Tractatus is a tightly structured aphoristic text aimed at identifying the logical form of propositions and the limits of meaningful language. Wittgenstein begins by declaring, "The world is everything that is the case." He proceeds to argue that the world consists of atomic facts, and language mirrors these facts through atomic propositions that combine logically to form meaningful statements. A proposition is meaningful only if it can picture or correspond to a possible state of affairs in reality. By this strict criterion, many traditional philosophical claims, especially those about ethics, aesthetics, or metaphysics, are nonsensical because they cannot be pictured in the world. Whereof one cannot speak, thereof one must be silent. This famous concluding statement signals that philosophical problems arise when language is misused to talk about what lies beyond the realm of empirical fact. The Tractatus thus draws a boundary around legitimate discourse, suggesting that philosophical questions are often pseudo-problems stemming from linguistic confusion. Logical positivism and early reception. Though Wittgenstein had not intended to found a school, the Vienna circle of logical positivists embraced aspects of the Tractatus as a manifesto of their verification principle. They admired Wittgenstein's insistence that only empirically verifiable statements, or tautological truths of logic, have meaning, consigning ethics, religion, and aesthetics to the realm of the emotive or nonsensical. However, Wittgenstein distanced himself from the positivists, sensing that his project had been partially misunderstood. While they found in him a champion of logical analysis, Wittgenstein had a more mystical dimension. He saw ethics and aesthetics as beyond the scope of propositional language, but not necessarily worthless. Transition to the later philosophy. In the 1930s, Wittgenstein began critiquing his earlier doctrines, culminating in his posthumously published masterpiece, Philosophical Investigations. He abandoned the idea of a fixed logical structure underlying language, instead focusing on how words acquire meaning through their use in diverse language games. A language game involves the practical, contextual activities in which language operates, e.g., asking, giving orders, making jokes, praying, or doing mathematics. Instead of one single essence, meaning is woven through a tapestry of these varied uses. For a large class of cases, though not for all, in which we employ the word meaning, it can be defined thus: the meaning of a word is its use in the language. This shift de-emphasizes the representational theory of meaning, positing that the bewitchment of intelligence arises when we try to impose an overly rigid structure on language. Each language game has its own grammar and logic that cannot be reduced simply to picturing facts. Rule following and private language. A central theme of Wittgenstein's later work is the rule-following paradox. How do we know we are following a rule correctly when any new application might be interpreted in infinitely many ways? Wittgenstein argues that rule-following is inherently a social practice, embedded in communal training and agreement. The notion of a private language, one grounded in purely private experience that no one else can understand, is incoherent because language use depends on public criteria for correctness. This line of reasoning has major implications for the philosophy of mind. Wittgenstein dismantles the idea that words like pain refer to private inner objects. Instead, these terms gain meaning through their role in human behavior and shared life forms. He does not deny subjective experience, but questions whether it can serve as an unmediated foundation for language and knowledge. Family resemblances and the end of essences. In Philosophical Investigations, Wittgenstein famously introduces the concept of family resemblances to describe how concepts can be related without sharing a single common essence. He uses the example of games, which defy a single defining characteristic. Instead, there is a network of overlapping similarities, much like the resemblances among family members. This approach liberated analytic philosophy from the quest for definitive, necessary, and sufficient conditions for concept usage, redirecting attention to the everyday fluidity of language. Influence on analytic philosophy. Wittgenstein's later philosophy spawned new approaches to the philosophy of language, mind, and epistemology. Ordinary language philosophers like J.L. Austin and the later Gilbert Ryle built on Wittgenstein's insistence on attending to how words function in everyday contexts. In the mid-20th century, many British and American philosophers prized Wittgenstein's approach as an antidote to abstract theorizing. Some critics, however, found Wittgenstein's later work unsatisfying or overly dismissive of genuine philosophical problems. They accused him of quietism or conservatism, suggesting that focusing on language games and ordinary usage left deeper metaphysical and moral questions unaddressed. In turn, defenders argue that Wittgenstein did not so much ignore these questions as reframe them, showing that philosophical puzzles often arise from misapplications of language. Continuing debates and legacy. Wittgenstein's legacy is vast, shaping debates about whether philosophy should aspire to systematic theory or remain a form of conceptual clarification. His arguments about rules and social practices prefigure contemporary work in cognitive science, sociology of knowledge, and anthropology. The notion that meaning arises from public criteria resonates with social constructivist perspectives, though Wittgenstein himself was wary of overarching theories. Ethicists and theologians have also engaged with Wittgenstein. His stance that ethical propositions cannot be meaningfully stated in descriptive language leads some to interpret him as a moral skeptic or mystic. Others see in his emphasis on practice the seeds of a more communal or virtue ethics orientation, where moral language is woven into specific forms of life. In the philosophy of mind, his critique of private language raises questions about inner versus outer criteria for mental states, influencing debates on behaviorism, functionalism, and the limits of introspection. Even in aesthetics, Wittgenstein's remarks, often fragmentary, have been expanded into theories that treat aesthetic judgments as rule-governed yet deeply embedded in cultural practices. The man and his method. Wittgenstein's personality and method were as distinctive as his doctrines. He often engaged in fiercely intense dialogues, insisting that philosophical clarification was akin to therapy, unraveling confusions rather than building new doctrinal edifices. This approach is evident in his aphoristic style, rhetorical questions, and philosophical dialogues with imaginary interlocutors. For Wittgenstein, philosophy was an activity, an attempt to show the fly the way out of the fly bottle, rather than a body of doctrines. He also lived with unusual asceticism, giving away his inheritance, spending years in solitude and consistently questioning his own motives. Anecdotes describe him as demanding both of himself and his students, pushing them to see how philosophical riddles dissolve when we understand language's ordinary workings. Conclusion. Ludwig Wittgenstein reshaped analytic philosophy not once but twice. His early work in the Tractatus strove for a crystalline vision of language as mirroring the world's logical structure, only to be superseded by the later insights into language games, rule-following, and the pragmatic conditions of meaning. In doing so, Wittgenstein disrupted the quest for final philosophical theories, proposing instead a painstaking attention to how we actually speak, live, and understand each other. While some find his mature thought unsatisfying in its refusal to propose grand solutions, many see it as liberating, freeing philosophy from self-imposed conundrums. Across disciplines, Wittgenstein's emphasis on shared forms of life and the multiplicity of language uses continues to inspire reflection on how we construct meaning and how we might overcome confusions that plague our attempts to articulate the human condition. His legacy endures in the vigorous debates his ideas still spark, ensuring that his voice remains a singular and challenging presence in modern thought. 17. Martin Heidegger, 1889 to 1976. Martin Heidegger was one of the most influential and controversial philosophers of the 20th century. Born in 1889 in Meßkirch, Germany, Heidegger revolutionized phenomenology and existential philosophy, particularly with his magnum opus Being and Time, 1927. His focus on the question of being, his explorations of human existence as Dasein, and his complex relationship with National Socialism have all contributed to the enduring fascination and contention surrounding his work. A brief biography. Heidegger's early education was shaped by Catholic theology, and he initially prepared for the priesthood before turning to philosophy. Influenced by Edmund Husserl's phenomenology, Heidegger served as Husserl's assistant at the University of Freiburg. In 1927, Heidegger published Being and Time, a groundbreaking text that launched him to the forefront of European philosophy. He briefly became the rector of the University of Freiburg in 1933, during which time he joined the Nazi Party, an association that tarnished his legacy. After World War II, Heidegger was banned from teaching for a period due to denazification proceedings, but he continued writing prolifically. In later works such as Letter on Humanism and Contributions to Philosophy, from Inowning, he shifted his focus toward language, technology, and poetry. Heidegger died in 1976, leaving behind a voluminous body of work that continues to influence philosophy, literary theory, and cultural studies. Being and Time and the Question of Being. The central concern of Being and Time is the question of being, which Heidegger laments has been forgotten since Plato and Aristotle. He reorients philosophy away from abstract theorizing toward the concrete existential situation of the entity for whom being is a question, namely the human being, which he dubs Dasein, literally their being. We are ourselves the entities to be analyzed. The being of any such entity is in each case mine. In place of the Cartesian subject-object split, Heidegger situates Dasein in a world that is always already interpreted, structured by care, and oriented toward possibility. The meaning of being is sought through an analysis of Dasein's temporal existence, looking at everyday activities, our relationships to others, and crucially, our finitude. Dasein, authenticity, and being toward death. Heidegger introduces several key concepts to describe Dasein's situation: thrownness, Geworfenheit. We find ourselves always already thrown into a specific historical, cultural, and personal context we did not choose. Being in the world, we are not detached minds but engaged agents, using tools, interacting with others, and navigating social norms. Fallenness, Verfallen. Our tendency to lose ourselves in everyday chatter, distractions, and conformity to the they, das Man. Being toward death, Recognition of our finite existence reveals an ultimate horizon for our possibilities. Contemplating one's mortality can shock Dasein out of inauthenticity and prompt an authentic stance toward life. Death is a possibility of being that Dasein itself has to take over in every case. With death, Dasein stands before itself in its own most potentiality for being. Authenticity arises when we take personal responsibility for our choices, guided by an awareness of mortality that cuts through social illusions. Still, Heidegger does not advocate a solipsistic escape from community. Rather, authenticity involves a more lucid engagement with the social world, albeit on one's own terms. Language, truth, and aletheia. Heidegger's later philosophy breaks with the modern subject-centered tradition even more decisively. He reinterprets truth not as correspondence between statements and reality, but as aletheia, an unconcealing or revealing. Language, in Heidegger's view, is not a mere tool for describing the world. It is the very medium in which beings come to presence. Heidegger critiques technological thinking, which he sees as a mode of enframing, Gestell, that reduces everything, including humans, to a resource or standing reserve. Poetry and art, by contrast, can disclose new ways of relating to being, circumventing the oppressive grip of instrumental rationality. Political controversy, Heidegger and Nazism. Heidegger's embrace of National Socialism and his rectorship at Freiburg in 1933 remain sources of heated debate. While he resigned the rector position a year later, he never publicly recanted his Nazi Party membership. Critics argue that elements of Heidegger's thought, his emphasis on the folk, destiny, and homeland, could lend themselves to nationalist and totalitarian ideologies. His defenders counter that these associations represent a temporary, grave political error, separate from the deeper philosophical innovations in his work. Post-war revelations, including the release of the Black Notebooks, have intensified scrutiny, revealing anti-Semitic passages that are difficult to dismiss as mere errors. Some scholars attempt to bracket Heidegger's politics from his ontology, while others see them as intertwined. Regardless, the question of how to reconcile Heidegger's philosophical insights with his political failings continues to provoke intense scholarly debate. Influence on existentialism and phenomenology. Heidegger's impact on existentialism is profound. Although he distanced himself from the label existentialist, figures like Jean-Paul Sartre drew heavily on Heidegger's analysis of human freedom, authenticity, and the situated self. Indeed, Sartre's being and nothingness might be read as a more humanistic interpretation of some Heideggerian motifs, though Sartre's emphasis on consciousness and freedom diverges from Heidegger's focus on being. Heidegger's reinterpretation of phenomenology also influenced the French tradition, including Maurice Merleau-Ponty, who expanded on Heidegger's insights about embodied perception. In Germany, Hans-Georg Gadamer's hermeneutic philosophy was shaped by Heidegger's attention to historical tradition and language's role in revealing truth. Impact on literary theory and deconstruction. Post-structuralists like Jacques Derrida were deeply influenced by Heidegger's later thought on language, being, and difference. Derrida's strategy of deconstruction echoes Heidegger's call to question the metaphysical tradition that privileges presence, identity, and stable meanings. Deconstruction can be seen as an extension of Heidegger's quest to uncover concealed assumptions in Western thought, though Derrida takes it in more radically skeptical directions. In literary studies, Heidegger's emphasis on poiesis and the poetic use of language opened avenues for exploring how texts disclose or veil dimensions of being. His readings of Hölderlin, Rilke, and Trakl highlight how poetry can offer glimpses of new ways of dwelling in the world. Criticisms and reappraisals. Beyond political controversies, Heidegger's philosophy faces internal criticisms. Some argue Being and Time remains incomplete. Heidegger never published the planned second half. Others find his prose obscure, accusing him of obscurantism, especially in his later works where he forges neologisms and reclaims archaic German terms. Analytic philosophers often reject Heidegger's style and question the verifiability of his claims about being. Still, dialogue between analytic and continental traditions has grown, with some contemporary philosophers seeking to clarify Heidegger's ontological insights using more rigorous frameworks. Heidegger's legacy today. Despite the challenges in interpreting and evaluating his legacy, Heidegger's influence is undeniable. He redefined phenomenology to focus on being in the world, forging connections between ontology, hermeneutics, and existential concerns. His critique of technology resonates in current debates about AI, environmental exploitation, and the loss of meaningful connection to nature and community. His notion of authenticity, despite potential pitfalls, continues to shape discussions on how individuals might live meaningfully in a secular, rapidly changing world. For many, Heidegger exemplifies both the heights of philosophical creativity and the depths of moral political failure. The tension between his intellectual achievements and his Nazi affiliation poses a cautionary tale about the inseparability of philosophy from life choices and historical context. At the same time, the enduring relevance of his insights into human finitude, temporality, and the unveiling of being ensures that Heidegger remains a necessary, if deeply problematic, touchstone in the ongoing conversation about what it means to be human. 18. Jean-Paul Sartre, 1905 to 1980. Jean-Paul Sartre was a French philosopher, playwright, novelist, and political activist who became the leading figure of existentialism in the mid-20th century. Born in Paris in 1905, Sartre's intellectual and cultural impact spanned continents, bridging philosophy, literature, and social theory. His core existentialist dictum, "Existence precedes essence," captured a cultural mood of individual responsibility, freedom, and the weight of human choice in an apparently absurd world. A brief biography. Sartre studied at the École Normale Supérieure, where he formed a lifelong partnership with philosopher Simone de Beauvoir. During World War II, he served briefly in the French army, was captured by German forces, and spent 9 months as a prisoner of war. After his release, he became active in the French resistance. Post-war, Sartre's prolific output included philosophical treatises, plays, novels, and political essays. He refused the Nobel Prize in Literature in 1964, asserting that a writer should not become an institution. Sartre died in 1980, leaving behind a legacy that redefined how modern thinkers approach freedom, authenticity, and political commitment. Existentialism. Existence precedes essence. In works like Being and Nothingness, 1943, and the popular lecture, Existentialism is a Humanism, 1946, Sartre argued that humans are condemned to be free. Unlike objects whose essence is defined before they are made, a paper knife, for instance, designed with a specific function, humans first exist without any pre-given essence. Only through their choices and actions do they forge their identity. Man is nothing else but that which he makes of himself. This radical freedom carries an equally radical responsibility. There are no objective, predetermined values to guide us. Each person must create values through acting. This can produce anguish, as one faces the burden of deciding not only for oneself, but, in a sense, for all humanity, since one's choices reflect the image of what one believes a human being should be. Being for itself and being in itself. In Being and Nothingness, Sartre distinguishes between being in itself, en soi, the mode of existence of things, which simply are what they are, like a rock. Being for itself, pour soi, the mode of conscious beings, characterized by a capacity for self-awareness and negation. Human consciousness can envision possibilities, reflect on its own state, and imagine what is not. This self-awareness opens the space for freedom, but also for self-deception or bad faith. Bad faith occurs when we lie to ourselves, denying our freedom by assuming fixed roles, e.g., the waiter who over-identifies with his job, or hiding behind deterministic excuses. Bad faith and authenticity. Sartre's notion of bad faith captures how humans often evade the anxiety of absolute freedom. We might treat ourselves as a thing, like being inescapably shy or determined by social roles, or pretend we have no commitments at all. Either strategy is self-deception, refusing to acknowledge the projective nature of consciousness. Authenticity, for Sartre, requires owning one's freedom and the responsibility that accompanies it, even if that means living with existential anguish. the look and interpersonal relations. A distinctive feature of Sartre's phenomenology is his analysis of the other's gaze. In encountering another person, we suddenly become aware of ourselves as an object in their field of vision. This experience can lead to shame or pride, depending on how we imagine the other perceives us. The interplay of subject and object in personal relationships is fraught with tension, as each consciousness strives to preserve its own freedom, yet inevitably objectifies the other. This exploration of intersubjectivity influenced later thinkers, including Merleau-Ponty and Frantz Fanon, who studied how racialized or colonized subjects experience the oppressive gaze of a dominant group. Literary contributions and key works. Sartre's philosophical ideas found expression in his plays and novels. In No Exit, 1944, three deceased characters locked in a room torment each other psychologically, symbolizing Sartre's concept of interpersonal hell. Hell is other people is the play's famous line, illustrating the tortured dynamics of mutual objectification. In the novel Nausea, 1938, the protagonist Roquentin struggles with the unsettling contingency of existence, experiencing a visceral revulsion at the raw there-ness of objects. This literary approach effectively dramatized Sartre's philosophical insights, making existentialism accessible to a broader public. Political engagement and Marxism. By the post-war period, Sartre was convinced that existentialism's ethics of freedom demanded engagement in broader social and political struggles. He flirted with communism, although he never officially joined the Communist Party. In works like Critique of Dialectical Reason, 1960, Sartre attempted to synthesize existentialism with Marxism, focusing on issues of collective action, class struggle, and alienation in modern society. He condemned French colonialism in Algeria, supported anti-colonial movements worldwide, and defended the students during the May 1968 protests in Paris. His political activism, however, drew criticism from those who saw him as inconsistently juggling existential freedom with Marxist determinism. Nonetheless, Sartre argued that human freedom and responsibility do not vanish under historical conditions. Rather, these conditions shape the constraints within which freedom operates. Relationship with Simone de Beauvoir. Sartre's lifelong intellectual and romantic partnership with Simone de Beauvoir significantly impacted both of their works. De Beauvoir's The Second Sex, 1949, advanced a groundbreaking feminist existentialism, analyzing how societal roles and myths constrain women's freedom. While Sartre wrote extensively on freedom and oppression, de Beauvoir applied existential categories to gender, highlighting the ways in which women are objectified as other in patriarchal culture. Their collaboration underscores the central existentialist concern with how individuals navigate social and historical contexts. Critiques and later reception. Sartre's emphasis on radical freedom has been criticized as overly individualistic or neglectful of unconscious motivations. Psychoanalytic thinkers argue that Sartre underestimates the role of unconscious drives in shaping behavior. Religious philosophers charge that Sartre's atheistic existentialism offers scant consolation or moral guidance beyond personal commitment. In response, Sartre's defenders claim that existentialism fosters moral seriousness and acknowledges the situational constraints on freedom, while maintaining that individuals cannot escape responsibility. Moreover, his later works, especially Critique of Dialectical Reason, delve deeper into collective action and historical conditioning, suggesting a more nuanced view of freedom. Ongoing influence. Sartre's existentialism left an indelible mark on post-war thought, influencing existential psychoanalysis, e.g., R.D. Laing, and pioneering movements in radical political theory. His literary output continues to resonate in theatre and fiction, exploring how ordinary individuals confront freedom, absurdity, and oppression. Even the phrase bad faith has seeped into everyday discourse, capturing the all-too-familiar phenomenon of self-deception. Philosophers in the continental tradition often trace questions of authenticity, otherness, and commitment back to Sartre's early phenomenological analyses. His stance that we must invent values in a godless universe remains a potent challenge in secular ethics. Meanwhile, in global politics, the question of how an individual's freedom relates to collective liberation echoes Sartre's struggles with Marxism, colonialism, and activism. In sum, Jean-Paul Sartre stands as a defining voice of 20th century existentialism, urging humanity to confront its freedom and craft meaning in a contingent world. Whether read as a champion of radical individual choice or as a politically engaged intellectual wrestling with social constraints, Sartre's work continues to provoke reflection on how we might live authentically amid uncertain moral horizons. His prolific career, stretching from abstruse phenomenology to populist plays, from existential psychoanalysis to revolutionary pamphlets, mirrors the restless spirit of an age grappling with war, oppression, and the search for new foundations of human dignity. 19th. Michel Foucault, 1926 to 1984. Michel Foucault was a French philosopher, social theorist, and historian of ideas whose work challenged conventional understandings of power, knowledge, and the self. Born in Poitiers, France in 1926, Foucault became one of the most influential thinkers of the late 20th century, shaping disciplines as diverse as sociology, cultural studies, literary theory, and political science. His genealogical method, examining the historical contingencies that shape discourses and institutions, remains a vital tool for critiquing how societies define normalcy, deviance, and truth. A brief biography. Educated at the École Normale Supérieure in Paris, Foucault was influenced by existentialism, structuralism, and phenomenology. He joined the French Communist Party briefly, but distanced himself from dogmatic politics thereafter. His academic career took him across Europe before he returned to France, eventually becoming a professor at the Collège de France in 1970. Foucault's major works include Madness and Civilization, 1961, The Birth of the Clinic, 1963, The Order of Things, 1966, Discipline and Punish, 1975, and the multi-volume History of Sexuality, 1976 to 1984. He died of complications related to AIDS in 1984, at a time when he was still actively refining his analysis of subjectivity and power. Archaeology, genealogy, and the critique of reason. Foucault's early work employed an archaeological method to study how disciplines like medicine, psychiatry, and the social sciences emerged historically. In The Order of Things, he outlines epistemes, or underlying structures of thought in different epochs, arguing that concepts we take for granted, such as man as the center of knowledge, are historically contingent. He later shifted to a genealogical approach, drawing on Nietzsche. Rather than searching for linear progress, Foucault's genealogies reveal how power relations and discursive practices produce truths. For Foucault, knowledge is not an objective mirror of reality, but is intertwined with the exercise of power. There is a battle for truth, or at least around truth, it being understood once again that by truth I do not mean the ensemble of truths which are to be discovered and accepted, but rather the ensemble of rules according to which the true and the false are separated and specific effects of power attached to the true. Discipline and Punish, The Birth of the Prison. One of Foucault's most influential works is Discipline and Punish, a history of the modern penal system. He contrasts the medieval spectacle of public torture with the emergence of disciplined, docile bodies in the 18th and 19th centuries. Modern institutions, schools, factories, prisons, employ surveillance, regimentation, and examination to shape individuals' behavior. Foucault uses the image of the panopticon, a prison design by Jeremy Bentham, as a metaphor for modern power, where inmates internalize surveillance and regulate themselves. This disciplinary power operates not through overt violence but through subtle control of daily routines and the normalization of behavior. Power knowledge and biopolitics. For Foucault, power is not possessed by a dominant class or state, but circulates through societal networks shaping discourse and institutions. Knowledge and power are intertwined. Each form of knowledge, psychiatry, criminology, sexuality, defines new objects of study and new norms, thereby exercising power over people who become the subjects of that knowledge. Power is everywhere, not because it embraces everything, but because it comes from everywhere. In his later works, Foucault introduced the concept of biopower, describing how modern states regulate populations through policies on health, reproduction, and life processes. This biopolitical focus reveals how governance extends to managing the vitality of entire populations, from birth rates to public health measures. History of sexuality and the repressive hypothesis. Foucault's History of Sexuality debunks what he calls the repressive hypothesis, which suggests that modern society has stifled sexual expression since the Victorian era. Instead, Foucault argues that power historically produced an explosion of discourses about sex, medical, psychiatric, legal, seeking to categorize and manage sexual behavior. This proliferation of talk about sexuality exemplifies how power motivates classification, normalization, and self-regulation. He also studied the ancient practices of the care of the self, exploring how individuals in Greek and Roman antiquity constructed ethical subjectivities around their desires and bodily practices. His unfinished volumes on sexuality point toward a notion of freedom as an ongoing practice of self-creation within the constraints of power relations. The subject, governmentality, and ethical self-fashioning. Later in his life, Foucault developed the concept of governmentality, examining how modern states govern not only through laws, but through the subtle shaping of conduct via institutions, administrative techniques, and social norms. Individuals become subjects, both subjected to power and actively shaping themselves. This dual process of subjection and subjectivation is at the heart of Foucault's philosophy of the subject. He thus moves away from purely structural analyses of power toward questions of how individuals constitute themselves ethically. In The Use of Pleasure and the Care of the Self, Foucault explores how ancient Greeks cultivated virtues through self-reflection, suggesting that modern societies might rediscover such practices to resist disciplinary norms. Political engagement and activism. While Foucault initially kept a critical distance from organized politics, he became more publicly engaged in issues like prison reform and the Iranian Revolution. He criticized the penal system's inhumanity and advocated for the rights of prisoners and other marginalized groups. His commentary on Iran in the late 1970s, however, was controversial, with critics arguing that he underestimated the revolution's potential for authoritarianism. Despite these controversies, Foucault's willingness to address concrete political struggles exemplified his belief that intellectual work cannot remain purely theoretical. He wanted his analyses of power to inform activism, encouraging constant skepticism about how institutions label and govern individuals. Critiques of Foucault. Foucault's work has been subject to various criticisms. Marxists argue that he neglects the centrality of class relations and economic exploitation by dispersing power throughout micro-level practices. Feminists have both embraced his insights on the body and sexuality and critiqued his relative lack of attention to patriarchal structures. Others accuse him of moral relativism, suggesting that by refusing universal normative standards, he offers few tools for resisting domination. In response, Foucault's defenders point out that his genealogies reveal possibilities for resistance precisely by exposing how discourses function. By showing that what is taken as natural or inevitable is actually historically contingent, Foucault opens space for transformative action. Contemporary impact. Foucault's thought underlies much of post-structuralism and informs critical theories of race, gender, and sexuality. Queer theory, for instance, builds on Foucault's idea that identities like homosexual were historically constructed categories rather than timeless essences. Post-colonial scholars utilize Foucault's insights to examine how colonial powers classified and controlled subject populations. His concept of biopower is invoked in debates on public health, immigration, and reproductive rights, especially in analyzing how states manage and categorize bodies deemed deviant. In academia, Foucauldian analysis is almost a shorthand for genealogical critique, tracing how discourses emerge, dominate, and shape subjects. Philosophers grapple with his challenge to Enlightenment notions of truth and subjectivity, while sociologists and historians refine his methods in empirical studies. Across the humanities, Foucault's suspicion of stable essences or human nature resonates with ongoing efforts to explore how power dynamics produce social realities. A lasting critical lens. Michel Foucault thus stands as a major theorist of power and the historical construction of knowledge. His genealogical method, linking epistemology and social control, offers a potent critique of institutions like prisons, asylums, clinics, and schools. His emphasis on discourse has permeated countless fields, encouraging scholars to examine how language, classification, and institutional practices shape possibilities for thought and action. While controversies persist around his political stances and the practicality of his theory, few dispute his transformative impact on modern intellectual life. By insisting that we must not conclude that power is bad, Foucault showed how power is embedded in everything we do, simultaneously constraining and enabling us. His provocative insights remain indispensable for anyone seeking to understand how societies define truth, regulate bodies, and produce subjects, concerns as pressing today as they were in his lifetime. Dvadsyaty John Rawls, Narozeny 2021, Zomrel 2022. John Bawdley Rawls was an American political philosopher whose work revived and reshaped the field of normative political theory in the latter half of the 20th century. Best known for his 1971 book, A Theory of Justice, Rawls introduced a rigorous framework for thinking about justice, equality, and the social contract in modern democratic societies. His ideas have left a profound mark on moral and political philosophy, influencing both academic debate and practical discourse on public policy. A brief biography. Born in Baltimore, Maryland in 1921, Rawls studied at Princeton University before serving in the U.S. Army during World War II. After the war, he returned to Princeton for his Ph.D. in philosophy and then taught at Cornell, MIT, and eventually Harvard, where he spent much of his career. Rawls was famously a meticulous teacher and scholar, publishing relatively few books, but investing extraordinary care in refining his arguments over decades. His major works include A Theory of Justice, 1971, Political Liberalism, 1993, The Law of Peoples, 1999, and The Posthumous Justice as Fairness, A Restatement, 2001. He died in 2002, leaving behind a legacy that continues to shape debates on justice, equality, and constitutional democracy. A Theory of Justice and Justice as Fairness. At the heart of Rawls's philosophy is the concept of justice as fairness. He proposes a thought experiment known as the original position, where rational individuals choose principles of justice from behind a veil of ignorance. In this hypothetical scenario, one does not know one's race, class, gender, talents, or social status. This ignorance is meant to ensure impartiality in the selection of just principles. No one knows his place in society, his class position or social status. The principles of justice are chosen behind a veil of ignorance. From this original position, Rawls posits two fundamental principles of justice. Equal basic liberties. Each person should have the greatest equal basic liberties compatible with similar liberty for others, e.g., freedom of speech, conscience, political participation. Difference principle. Social and economic inequalities are permissible only if they benefit the least advantaged members of society and are attached to positions open to all under conditions of fair equality of opportunity. These principles reflect Rawls's belief that a just society would not allow major disparities unless they could be shown to improve the lot of the worst-off group. The veil of ignorance and contractarianism. Rawls's use of a social contract framework harks back to thinkers like Locke, Rousseau, and Kant, but with a modern twist. By insisting on the veil of ignorance, Rawls aims to eliminate bias and special interests in the choice of principles. This approach differs from traditional contractarians who might rely on state-of-nature scenarios or moral assumptions about human nature. For Rawls, reasoned choice under fair conditions of ignorance yields principles that protect individual liberty and address social and economic inequalities. The two principles explained. First principle, basic liberties. This principle takes priority over other concerns in what Rawls calls lexical priority: political freedoms, freedom of thought, and personal property rights are fundamental. He precludes trading off these basic liberties for economic gains, unlike utilitarians who might sacrifice some liberties for greater aggregate welfare. Second principle, fair equality of opportunity. Offices and positions must be open to all under conditions that ensure equal chances to attain them, considering differences in starting points. Difference principle. Inequalities in income, wealth, or status are acceptable only if they improve the positions of the least advantaged. This principle is sometimes summarized as allowing incentives for economic productivity so long as they help the worst off. Thus, the difference principle is a strongly egalitarian conception in the sense that unless there is a distribution that makes both persons better off, we are to leave them as we found them. In practice, a Rawlsian society would allow higher pay for certain professions or risk-taking activities if, and only if, these disparities also enhance the welfare of the poorest citizens, through increased tax revenues, job creation, or innovation, for example. Critiques of Rawls. Libertarian critiques. Figures like Robert Nozick challenged Rawls's emphasis on distributive justice, arguing that property rights and individual freedom should not be compromised by redistributive schemes. Nozick's Anarchy, State and Utopia contends that coercive taxation to benefit the worst off violates self-ownership and free exchange. Communitarian critiques. Philosophers like Michael Sandel and Charles Taylor criticized Rawls's abstract individualism, suggesting that real people are shaped by community ties, culture, and history. Thus, they argue, the veil of ignorance strips away too much, neglecting how communal values inform justice. Marxist critiques. From a more radical angle, Marxists see Rawls's framework as preserving capitalist wage labor and private property relations. They argue that true emancipation requires dismantling class structures, not merely redistributing wealth within them. Feminist critiques. Some feminists question whether Rawls adequately addresses gender-based inequalities such as caregiving burdens within his model. Susan Moller Okin, for example, argued that the family is an institution of distribution itself, yet remains largely outside Rawls's scope. Despite these criticisms, Rawls' vision remains a potent benchmark for liberal egalitarian thinking, shaping policy debates on progressive taxation, welfare programs, and social justice reforms. Political liberalism and overlapping consensus. In Political Liberalism, 1993, Rawls refined his theory by addressing the reality of pluralism in modern democratic societies. Recognizing that citizens hold diverse religious and moral views, he introduced the notion of an overlapping consensus, where different groups might endorse shared political principles for their own reasons. This concept acknowledges that a stable, just society cannot rely on a single comprehensive doctrine, but rather on a political conception of justice that various doctrines can support. He thereby moved away from a strictly metaphysical or moral argument toward a more pragmatic approach, focusing on how institutions might secure enduring stability and legitimacy amid deep value differences. The Law of Peoples. Rawls extended his theory to the international arena in The Law of Peoples, 1999. He proposed guidelines for how peoples, rather than states, should relate to one another. While endorsing certain human rights standards globally, Rawls did not advocate a global egalitarian principle akin to the difference principle. This stance drew criticism from cosmopolitan theorists like Charles Bates and Thomas Pogge, who argue that global economic inequalities require a more robust redistributive approach. Nevertheless, Rawls's approach to international justice emphasizes decent governance, human rights, and respect for cultural diversity. He distinguishes liberal peoples from decent hierarchical societies, allowing for some variation in political structure as long as basic human rights and fairness in international relations are upheld. Legacy and contemporary relevance. John Rawls's impact on political philosophy can scarcely be overstated. He revitalized normative theory at a time when many believed that analytic philosophy could only handle logic and language, not moral or political questions. His method, combining formal argument, intuition, and a robust sense of moral psychology, set a new standard of rigor. Policy debates on taxation, welfare, education, and healthcare often reference Rawlsian ideals, contending that society should be organized to improve the prospects of its most disadvantaged members. Even critics often frame their arguments in response to Rawls, testifying to his centrality. Neo-Rawlsian scholars, such as Thomas Pogge, adapt Rawls's theory to global contexts, arguing for institutional reforms that address worldwide poverty and inequality. In academia, Rawls' theory stands as a reference point for courses on ethics, political philosophy, and public policy. Debates about whether real-world policies, like progressive income taxes or universal healthcare, fulfill the difference principle remain a staple of liberal and social democratic politics. Conversely, libertarian and conservative critics dispute Rawls's assumption that social cooperation should override natural property rights, or that the state should act as an agent of distributive justice. Concluding reflections. John Rawls offered a vision of society grounded in fairness and mutual respect, emphasizing that justice is a matter of how institutions distribute not merely material resources, but also rights and opportunities. His original position and veil of ignorance remain powerful conceptual tools for evaluating the justice of social arrangements. By reconciling personal liberty with a concern for the worst off, Rawls aimed to show that freedom and equality need not be at odds. While Rawls' theory may not resolve all philosophical or practical dilemmas, indeed critics highlight many complexities, it has permanently transformed how we talk about fairness, equality, and the legitimate scope of public power. In an era of widening inequality and cultural fragmentation, Rawls's insistence on the moral primacy of justice and the possibility of an overlapping consensus remains an enduring beacon for those seeking a rational, inclusive, and humane foundation for political life. Conclusion of the history, Philosophers 1 through 20. From the pragmatic realism of Niccolò Machiavelli in the early 16th century through the towering systems of Descartes, Hobbes, Locke, Spinoza, Leibniz, Berkeley, Hume, Kant, and onto the sweeping visions of Hegel, Schopenhauer, Mill, Marx, Nietzsche, Wittgenstein, Heidegger, Sartre, Foucault, and Rawls, modern philosophy charts a dynamic confrontation with power, reason, freedom, and human flourishing. Each thinker, in his own way, wrestled with the questions of how we come to know ourselves, how we should live collectively, and how we might interpret or transform the very structure of reality. The story arcs from Renaissance humanism and the scientific revolution to Enlightenment individualism, from existential anguish to the genealogies of power, and from grand metaphysical systems to rigorous analytic clarifications. Whether seeking universal truths or unraveling the illusions of fixed concepts, these 20 philosophers collectively shaped the modern intellectual landscape. Their works continue to spark debate, inspire reform, and challenge our assumptions about knowledge, morality, politics, and the meaning of human existence. In an increasingly complex and globalized world, their diverse legacies remind us that philosophy remains a vital, evolving dialogue about who we are, what we can know, and how we might best live together.